My husband stashed 4 ounces of cocaine in the lining of my Toomey carry-on at 5:47 in the morning, and by 6:52 at the TSA screening line at O'Hare, it was zipped inside his secretary's Louis Vuitton tote instead. He didn't find out until her name got called over the intercom. I have never in my life seen a man's face lose that much color that fast. If you've ever watched someone's whole plan collapse in real time, in public, in front of people whose respect he'd spent 11 years building, comment the city you're watching from right now, hit subscribe, and stay, because this is the story of how I became the villain in my husband's story, so I could become the author of my own. 3 things were happening at once that morning, and I only understood the shape of all 3 by the end. The first was money. $291,000 had moved out of the joint trust my grandmother left me, the one with my name on the paperwork and, I would later learn, a signature that was not mine on a document that authorized it. The second was a woman named Chelsea Monroe, 27 years old, with a laugh that carried across restaurants and a habit of touching my husband's forearm when she thought I wasn't looking, which was often, because Chelsea Monroe had decided a long time ago that I wasn't a woman worth watching. The third was the plan itself, the one I hadn't told anyone about yet. Not my sister, not my father, not even the man I would eventually call at 11 that night from a hotel bathroom with the fan running so no one could hear me cry. Which, for the record, I only did once. And I want you to remember that, because everything else you're about to hear, I did with a completely dry face. My name is Vanessa Castellano, Vanessa Ashford technically, for another 104 days, though I didn't know the exact number yet on the morning this starts. I am 38 years old. I am the managing partner of a 9-person forensic accounting firm called Castellano & Reyes, tucked into the 11th floor of a building on North LaSalle that most people walk past without noticing, which is precisely how I like it. We get called in after the money is already gone, after the CFO has fled to a jurisdiction with no extradition treaty, after the nonprofit board realizes their executive director bought a lake house in Wisconsin on a salary of $91,000 a year, after a family discovers that dad's second set of books wasn't a paperwork error. I find money that doesn't want to be found. That is the entire skill set. It sounds unglamorous until you understand that every liar leaves a trail, because lying, at scale, requires bookkeeping. And bookkeeping is a language I have spoken since I was 19 years old, sitting in my grandmother's kitchen in Cicero, teaching myself double-entry ledgers out of a library book because I liked that everything had to balance. Debits on one side, credits on the other. Nothing hidden, nothing missing, nothing that didn't add up to 0 in the end. I have built a career, a reputation, and eventually a very specific and very cold kind of patience around that single idea. Everything has to add up to 0 in the end. My husband, Bradford Ashford, Brad to the 600 and change people who followed his firm on LinkedIn, is 41 years old and runs or ran or claimed to run a real estate development company called Ashford Meridian Group. When I met him 9 years ago at a Cook County Bar Association fundraiser, I was not attending as a lawyer, but as the forensic accountant hired to make sure the silent auction numbers matched the deposit slips. He was standing by the bar in a navy suit that fit him the way expensive things fit people who've never had to actually pay full price for anything. Laughing at something a city alderman had said, and I remember thinking, before I knew a single true thing about him, that he looked like a man who had never once in his life had to check his own math. I found that restful. I did not yet understand that it was also the whole diagnosis. Brad's family has a name in Chicago the way certain families do. Not old money in the way people mean it on the coasts, but 3 generations deep in mid-sized construction and just enough ribbon cuttings with just enough aldermen in the photo that the Ashford name still opened doors. Even after, and I would only learn how much after there truly was over the course of the next several months. Even after the actual money had mostly evaporated somewhere around the time Brad's father, Walter Ashford, retired from running Ashford Construction into Ashford Meridian's slow-motion version of the same decline, 22 years and, I would eventually calculate down to the dollar, $416,000 in accumulated debt service later. Walter is 70 years old, silver-haired, 6'2", and carries himself like a man who is still owed something by a city that, in his mind, simply hasn't caught up yet to how important he is. Walter's fixed idea, repeated to me at every family dinner for 9 years in some new and creative arrangement of the same 12 words, is that the Ashford name is an asset that other people are lucky to be associated with. Mine included, he liked to remind me, usually somewhere around the second glass of Malbec, since apparently my little bookkeeping business, his words verbatim, more than once, wouldn't have half its client roster without the Ashford name attached to my married signature on the letterhead. I let him believe that for years. It cost me nothing and it made dinners shorter. Brad's mother, Diane Ashford, is 66, blonde in the specific expensive way that requires a standing Tuesday appointment, and has never once in 9 years asked me a single question about myself that wasn't actually a question about how I could be useful to her. Diane's fixed idea is that she is, by some birthright never actually specified, simply above the ordinary friction of other people's lives, above waiting in lines, above hearing the word no, above budgets, above, apparently, ever once acknowledging that the catering deposit for Brad's sister's wedding, the one Diane insisted needed a raw bar and a string quartet, came out of an account with my name on it. Diane does not ask. Diane assumes with the total, weightless confidence of someone who has never once been told to leave a party. And then there's Grant, Brad's younger brother, 34, currently on what Diane calls his consulting era, which is a phrase I have come to understand means Grant has not held a job with a W-2 attached to it in 6 years, floats between the guest suite of his parents' house in Winnetka and a rotating cast of one-bedroom sublets, and has, at 4 separate family functions I can name from memory, asked me, a woman with an actual license and an actual firm and an actual 11th floor office, whether I could take a look at some fund he was thinking about putting money into. Money that was never his. Money that, on 2 of those 4 occasions, turned out to already belong to his mother's household account. Grant's fixed idea is that effort is a design flaw other people haven't figured out how to route around yet. He has never once in 9 years offered to pay for a meal, refill a gas tank, or arrive anywhere on time, and he has never once seemed to notice that this was worth noticing. I tell you all 4 of them now: Brad, Walter, Diane, Grant. Not because I want your sympathy yet, but because you need the full board before I start moving the pieces on it. This is a story about 4 fixed personalities colliding with one variable they never accounted for, which was that the little bookkeeping wife they'd spent 9 years treating as furniture with a checkbook had, the entire time, been quietly the only competent financial mind in the family, and had simply chosen, for 9 years, not to say so out loud. The morning it started, the real start, not the airport, though we'll get back to the airport, I promise you, because what happened at that gate deserves its full 15 minutes. Began 4 days earlier, on a Tuesday, when I opened an email from a compliance officer at Merit National Bank named Yolanda Ruiz, someone I had worked with 3 years earlier on an entirely unrelated matter involving a construction supply company and a very tidy little kickback scheme, and who had, out of nothing more than professional courtesy and the kind of instinct people in this field develop the way doctors develop a nose for a wrong-sounding cough, forwarded me a flagged wire authorization, $291,000. Moved out of the Castellano family trust, my grandmother's trust. The one that funded my firm's first 18 months of overhead when nobody else believed a 30-year-old Mexican-American woman from Cicero could build a forensic accounting practice from a card table, and into an escrow account tied to a project called Meridian Row, 11 mixed-use units on a lot in Pilsen that Ashford Meridian Group had been quietly and unsuccessfully trying to get financed for 14 months. The trust required 2 signatures for any disbursement over $10,000. Mine and my late grandmother's estate attorney, a man named Felix Novak, who had handled Castellano family paperwork since before I was born, and who, I discovered with one phone call that made my hands go very still and very cold on my kitchen counter at 9:14 that Tuesday night, had never signed anything. Novak's actual signature, when I pulled the notarized original I keep in my own files, was tall and slanted, with a distinctive downward hook on the final K. The signature on the disbursement authorization was close. It was close enough that a bank teller processing 400 transactions a day would never look twice. It was not close enough to survive someone whose entire career is built on knowing that close enough is where every fraud eventually dies. I did not confront Brad that night. I want to be honest with you about why, because I think you deserve the real reason and not the flattering one. The flattering reason would be that I am strategic, that I am patient, that I understood immediately that a woman who confronts a man with partial evidence hands him 3 days to build a story around the parts she hasn't found yet. That's true. But the real reason, sitting underneath the strategic one, was smaller and uglier. I wasn't ready to know. I had spent 9 years building a marriage on top of a foundation I had never actually inspected, the way you live in a house for a decade without ever once going down into the basement, and some tired, defended part of me understood that the second I asked Brad the question out loud, I would never again be a woman who simply didn't know. So instead, at 9:41 that Tuesday night, I did the only thing I have ever truly trusted myself to do when the ground gets uncertain. I opened a blank spreadsheet and I started building a ledger. Column A, date. Column B, amount. Column C, account of origin. Column D, account of destination. Column E, the one I added last, the one that took me 3 more days to have the stomach to fill in even once. Notes. By Thursday night, the spreadsheet had 41 rows. I found the second trust withdrawal, $68,000, 4 months earlier, routed through a shell entity called Murden Holdings LLC that I traced, in about 11 minutes, back to a P.O. box registered to Ashford Meridian Group's office manager, a sweet, overwhelmed woman named Pat, who had clearly signed whatever was put in front of her without reading the entity name. I found a home equity line of credit against our own house, our actual house, the gray stone on Hoyne Avenue that I had personally paid down $81,000 of principal on over 6 years, opened 4 months prior, with a joint account signature that I did not remember signing, for a reason that turned out to be extremely simple. I hadn't. I found, buried in a folder Brad thought was password protected but had in fact secured with the password of our dog's name plus his own birth year, a term sheet for Meridian Row showing a private lender. Not a bank, a private lender, the kind that charges 19% interest and takes a personal guarantee. Listing collateral that included, in a single line item I read 4 times to make sure I wasn't imagining it, my forensic accounting practices brokerage account. An account Brad had no legal authority to pledge. An account with my name and only my name on every piece of paper that had ever touched it. I did not cry on Thursday night either. I made tea. I sat at my kitchen island until 2 a.m., with the laptop glowing and my dog, a 12-year-old beagle mix named Ledger. Yes, I named my dog Ledger, and no, I am not sorry about it. Asleep against my foot, and I did the thing I have done for 11 years for other people's ruined marriages and collapsing businesses and betrayed nonprofits. I built the timeline. And somewhere around row 63, cross-referencing a hotel charge in Lake Geneva against Brad's calendar, which listed that same weekend as a site visit, I found Loop B sitting quietly inside Loop A, the way it almost always does, the way I have told 100 clients it almost always does, and somehow still felt, in my own kitchen, at 1:47 in the morning, like the floor had opened underneath me for exactly 4 seconds before I made myself close it back up and keep working. The hotel charge was for a 2-night suite at a boutique property called the Whitlock. 2 guests, according to the loyalty program receipt I found forwarded to an email alias I didn't know Brad had. Turned down service for 2. A $410 dinner at the hotel's restaurant, itemized, that included, I noticed with the specific, surgical calm I only find in the worst moments, 2 glasses of a Sancerre that I happen to know is Chelsea Monroe's drink, because I had sat across from her at exactly one Ashford Meridian holiday party 18 months earlier and listened to her explain, unprompted, to a table of people who had not asked, that she just can't do Chardonnay, it's too obvious. I am going to tell you exactly how I felt in that kitchen, because I think it matters, and because I think most of what you'll see online about women in my position gets it wrong. I did not feel destroyed. I felt something closer to what I imagine a surgeon feels the moment an X-ray finally explains 4 months of vague, roving pain, a kind of terrible, clarifying relief. There it was, not a feeling anymore. A number, a hotel folio number, specifically 4471. I wrote it in column E. By Friday morning, I had a name for what I was looking at. The same name I would have given any client who sat across from my desk with this exact shape of evidence. Brad was underwater on Meridian Row by an amount his own company couldn't absorb. He had used my trust, my house equity, and, pending, unsigned, but drafted and saved in a folder titled, with a total absence of self-awareness, v. MISC, a document that would have personally guaranteed my firm's assets against his default. And he was doing all of it while flying to Lake Geneva with his 27-year-old executive assistant on weekends he told me were site visits. I want to be extremely clear about something because I think it changes how you hear everything that comes after it. I was not yet planning revenge on Friday morning. I was still, primarily, trying to figure out how to protect my grandmother's trust, my house, and my firm from a man I had built a decade of Sunday mornings and joint tax returns with. The plan, the real plan, the one with a shape and a stage and an ending, didn't arrive until Saturday, at 6:47 a.m., in the security line at O'Hare, when I watched my husband's hand slide something into the outer pocket of my carry-on, while pretending to help me lift it onto the belt. I saw it. I want you to understand that I saw the entire thing in real time with the same flat, cataloging attention I bring to a general ledger. His hand at the pocket, the small vacuum-sealed weight of it, the 2-second delay before he stepped back and said, too brightly, "Got it, babe," in a voice I had heard him use exactly twice before in 9 years, both times right before he asked me to co-sign something. We were flying to Aspen for what Diane had been calling, for 6 weeks, the Ashford Family Legacy Weekend, a term she'd invented herself, for an event that was, in practical terms, a 4-day ski trip built around Walter's 70th birthday. Financed, I would later confirm from the credit card statement, almost entirely on the same home equity line that had funded Meridian Row. Brad, Walter, Diane, Grant, and... This detail I did not learn until we were already at the gate, watching her wheel a hard-sided Rimowa case toward the same TSA line as the rest of us. Her employee badge lanyard still looped through the handle out of what I can only assume was habit. Chelsea Monroe. Invited, Diane explained without a flicker of hesitation, to help Brad with a few investor calls over the weekend, since he simply cannot get a moment's peace otherwise. I have replayed the 90 seconds that followed more times than I can count, and I still don't fully know how I did what I did without my hands shaking, except that I think 11 years of finding other people's hidden things had built some quiet, patient machinery in me that simply switched on. We were funneled through the standard line together, 5 of us and our bags, TSA doing the ordinary Saturday morning shuffle of bins and belts and the low mechanical hum of the X-ray conveyor. Chelsea's tote, a soft, unstructured Louis Vuitton with an open top, because apparently even people orchestrating something reckless don't think to zip their bag closed at airport security, sat on the belt directly ahead of mine for exactly the length of time it took an agent to wave 2 people through the metal detector. 4 seconds. That's what it took. I set my own bag down beside hers, ostensibly straightening a tag, and in the same motion that any of the 11 strangers around us would have read as nothing more than a woman adjusting her luggage, I lifted the small vacuum-sealed packet out of the side pocket Brad had placed it in and let it drop, silent, into the loose canvas mouth of Chelsea Monroe's open tote bag. Then I stepped through the metal detector, arms raised, completely calm, and waited for the machine to do what machines do, which is not care at all whose name is on anything. Brad's face, when Chelsea's name was called over the intercom for a secondary bag check 4 minutes later, a soft, procedural, almost bored-sounding, "Monroe, Chelsea, please step to the secondary screening area with your belongings," did something I had genuinely never seen a human face do before. It didn't drain of color so much as it seemed to detach, for about a second and a half, from whatever muscles usually hold a face in place. Walter said, too loud, "What on earth?" in the exact tone he uses when a waiter brings the wrong wine. Diane's hand went to her chest like a woman in a period drama. Grant, to his credit, was the only one who laughed, once, before catching himself. And Brad, who I had watched charm a room of skeptical zoning commissioners into approving a variance 18 months earlier without breaking a sweat, stood frozen at the end of the conveyor belt, staring at the 2 TSA agents unzipping Chelsea's tote at the secondary table 20 feet away, and I watched something in him do the math. I watched him understand, in real time, that whatever he had planned to happen to me in a Colorado departure lounge, a search, a delay, a story he would later get to tell his parents about how unstable I'd become, how the stress of my little business was clearly getting to me, a story I am certain now had been rehearsed, was instead happening to the one person on the trip whose presence he could not explain to his family, in a security line in front of his wife, his parents, and his brother, 4 days after I had confirmed a signature that was not mine on a document that authorized the movement of $291,000 of my grandmother's dollars. "Babe," he said to me, and his voice cracked on the single syllable in a way I don't think I'd heard since our wedding toast. "Babe, I have no idea how." "Neither do I," said, "and I want you to know that this is the only lie I tell in this entire story. Because I did know, precisely, down to the 4 seconds it had taken, and I said it in the same even voice I used to tell a client their bookkeeper has been stealing from them for 6 years. A voice that does not shake, because shaking is a thing I decided. Somewhere around row 41 of that Thursday night spreadsheet, I was no longer available to do in front of this family. Chelsea did not fly to Aspen that day. Neither, as it turned out, 4 hours and one very unpleasant conversation with airport police later. A conversation in which Chelsea, panicking, volunteered Brad's name, their itinerary, and the phrase, "He told me it would be fine. He does this kind of thing for work stuff all the time. A sentence that would prove considerably more useful to me than she could have possibly understood, did the rest of us. We drove home from O'Hare in near total silence. Brad white-knuckled at the wheel of a car that, I noted with the same flat attention I'd given his hand at the security belt, was leased under an LLC that did not appear anywhere on our joint tax returns, and somewhere around the Kennedy Expressway, staring out the passenger window at a city I had built an entire life and career and reputation inside of, I stopped thinking of what was happening to me as a disaster. I started thinking of it as an opening balance. The Sunday after we got back from what remained of the Aspen trip, which is to say, the Sunday after Walter spent 4 hours on the phone doing what I can only describe as damage control theater, calling contacts at the Chicago Tribune's real estate desk to make sure nothing about an unfortunate misunderstanding at the airport would ever see print. And Diane retreated to her bedroom with a migraine that I am fairly confident was actually just fury with nowhere else to go. I drove to my father's condo in Lincoln Park with a thumb drive in my coat pocket and a decision already made. My father, Marcus Castellano, is 63 years old, and for 26 years he was a federal prosecutor with the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois, the last 11 of those specifically inside the financial crimes and public corruption section, before he retired 4 years ago to do exactly what every retired federal prosecutor in this city eventually does, which is take a rainmaking title at a white shoe firm and spend 3 days a week actually working. My parents divorced when I was 6. My mother raised me in Cicero on a schoolteacher's salary and my grandmother's stubbornness. My father, to his enormous credit, never missed a child support payment, never missed a school event he could physically attend, and taught me, across 100 Saturday breakfasts at a diner on Cermak that closed in 2019, that the law is a language just like accounting is a language, and that the people who win are very rarely the people who are right. They are the people who can prove it, in writing, in a form a judge cannot ignore. I did not tell my father I suspected fraud. I told him I needed a forensic second opinion on a case, the way I had asked him for exactly that 4 times in 11 years of running my firm, and I watched his face change somewhere around the 4th page of the printout, when he got to the signature comparison I'd laid out side by side. Novak's real signature, notarized, from 2019, and the one on the trust disbursement, blown up to 200% and annotated in red the way I annotate everything, showing the missing hook on the final K, the slightly too confident angle of the capital N, the kind of forgery that isn't sloppy so much as it's rushed, done by someone who has watched Novak sign things 100 times at family gatherings and thought that watching was the same thing as knowing. Vanessa, my father said, and he only uses my full name when he has stopped being my father and started being the version of himself I grew up watching walk into federal courtrooms. Whose signature do you think this actually is? I told him I didn't know yet. That was true, technically, in the narrowest legal sense, and also the last time in this entire story that I would let myself be that generous about what I already understood. What followed over the next 11 days was not, contrary to what you might expect from the words forensic investigation, dramatic. It was patient, granular, unglamorous work, the same work I do for clients 4 times a year, except that this time the client was me, and the stakes were not a stranger's inheritance but my own name on documents I hadn't signed. I want to walk you through it in some detail, not because every step is thrilling, but because I think there's something the revenge story version of events always skips past, which is that the actual undoing of a liar is rarely a single dramatic reveal. It's 100 small, tedious confirmations, stacked until the weight of them becomes undeniable even to the people standing on top of the pile. I started with the shell entity, Murden Holdings LLC. Illinois Secretary of State filings are public record, and it took me 4 minutes to pull the Articles of Organization, filed 19 months earlier, listing a registered agent service in Springfield, the kind that exists specifically so people don't have to put their real names on public paperwork, and a single manager, listed only by the initials BA. I already knew whose initials those were, but knowing and proving are different disciplines, and I had spent 11 years teaching junior associates the difference. I pulled the LLC's EIN application history through a records request. My father, still licensed, still connected, still owed favors by 3 different people at the IRS Criminal Investigation Division from his federal days, was able to expedite in a way that would have taken me 6 weeks on my own. The EIN application listed Bradford Ashford's Social Security number, not an initial, not an alias. His actual number, on a federal form, under penalty of perjury, tying him directly to an entity that existed for exactly one purpose: to receive $68,000 of my grandmother's trust money and immediately forward 59,000 of it, 4 days later, to a private lending group called Cascade Bridge Capital, the same 19% interest lender whose term sheet I'd found in Brad's badly hidden folder. I called Cascade Bridge Capital myself on a Tuesday afternoon, using a pretext I have used exactly 6 times in 11 years and have never once had fail me. I identified myself, accurately, as a forensic accountant retained in connection with a due diligence matter involving one of their borrowers, and asked, in the flattest and most bureaucratically boring voice I could manage, to confirm the collateral schedule attached to the Meridian Row facility. The loan officer, a young man named Dev Patel, who I could tell, within 30 seconds, badly wanted to seem more important on the phone than he actually was, read me the schedule without asking a single verifying question, which is a mistake I have built an entire career off of other people making. Collateral included the Meridian Row property itself, cross-collateralized against 40% equity in Ashford Meridian Group's headquarters lease, a personal guarantee from Bradford Ashford, and, item 4, read aloud to me in the same bored tone Dev Patel had used for the previous 3, a secondary personal guarantee, pledging spousal co-obligor assets, specifically identified as Castellano and Reyes Forensic Advisory's operating and reserve accounts. I had never signed a guarantee. I had never even seen this term sheet before Thursday night, 3 weeks earlier, in my own kitchen. Which meant one of two things was true. Either Cascade Bridge Capital had accepted a personal guarantee from me without my signature, which no lender that size does without a notarized document in file, or somewhere, in a folder I had not yet found, there existed a forged signature with my name on it, notarized by someone who either didn't check an ID or had been asked to look the other way. It took me 4 more days to find it, and when I did, it wasn't in a folder on Brad's laptop. It was in a fireproof lockbox in the back of our bedroom closet, behind a stack of old passports and my grandmother's rosary. A lockbox I had assumed for 9 years held nothing more interesting than our marriage certificate and Ledger's veterinary records, and which Brad, in one of the only genuinely careless moments of this entire affair, had left unlocked on a Sunday morning while he took Ledger for a walk, specifically so he could take a call I would later learn was from Cascade Bridge Capital's loan servicing department, asking, with what I imagine was mounting concern, why the Meridian Row interest payment was now 11 days late. The document inside was 6 pages, a personal guarantee dated 4 months earlier, bearing a signature that was, and I want to be precise here because precision is the entire point of everything I do, an extremely good forgery, better than the trust document. My actual signature has a specific, slightly impatient slant to the capital V, a habit left over from years of signing hundreds of engagement letters a month, and whoever created this one had clearly studied it far more carefully than whoever had rushed Felix Novak's. I would later learn, from a notary public's registration lookup that took me 11 minutes, that the notary stamp on page 6 belonged to a woman named Renee Ostrander, employed, according to her own LinkedIn profile, as an executive assistant at a title company 2 floors below Ashford Meridian Group's offices in the same building. A woman who, it would turn out during a later conversation I did not conduct myself, had notarized the signature based on nothing more than Brad's assurance that, my wife signed this at home, she's just swamped this week, you know how it is, and had never once laid eyes on me. I sat on the floor of my closet with that document in my lap for what my phone later told me was 51 minutes, and somewhere in the middle of that 51 minutes, I stopped feeling like a wife who had discovered something and started feeling, with a clarity that genuinely frightened me a little, like an accountant who had found the smoking gun in someone else's case file. Except that this time, the smoking gun had my own name forged onto it, in my own closet, 4 feet from where I slept every night next to the man who'd had it notarized. I photographed all 6 pages, front and back, with a document scanner app that timestamps and geotags every image, a habit so deeply trained into me by 11 years of chain of custody paranoia that I did it before I had even fully processed what I was looking at. Then I put the document back exactly where I'd found it, in exactly the same position, under exactly the same passports, because the entire architecture of what I was building depended on Brad never once suspecting, before I was ready, that I already knew. Over the following 2 weeks, while Brad grew increasingly erratic, snapping at Grant over nothing, disappearing into his home office for calls he took with the door shut, losing, visibly, the specific gravitational charm that had made rooms full of skeptical men want to write him checks for 14 years, I built what my father, reviewing my progress over a second round of diner coffee on a Saturday. I remember specifically because it would have been our 10th wedding anniversary in 6 weeks. called As Clean a Paper Trail as I Saw in 26 Years at the U.S. Attorney's Office. I traced 11 separate transfers totaling $409,000 moving out of accounts either solely in my name or jointly held, converging, every single time, on either Meridian Rose Escrow or Cascade Bridge Capital's interest payments. I obtained, through a former colleague of my father's now working compliance at Merit National, a full authenticated transaction log showing the trust disbursement had originated from an IP address matching Ashford Meridian Group's office router. Not our home network, not my phone, an office computer, logged in at 7:14 in the morning, 4 days before I received Yolanda Ruiz's flagged email. Under a username that belonged, according to the company's own IT vendor invoice, I subpoenaed nothing to get because my father simply asked a favor of a man who owed him one, to Brad himself. I also, on a Wednesday I will remember for the rest of my life, found Loop B's full shape, and I want to tell you about it plainly, without dramatizing it, because I think the plain version is worse than anything I could invent. Chelsea Monroe's texts, pulled not through any illegal means but because Brad, spooked after Aspen, had started leaving his phone unlocked on the kitchen counter with a kind of frantic, distracted carelessness that told me exactly how badly the airport had rattled him, and because I photographed, over 4 separate mornings while he was in the shower, everything visible on the lock screen and the messaging app he'd forgotten to relock showed a relationship that had started, according to a message dated 14 months earlier, at the Meridian Row groundbreaking, when you told me I was the only person in that whole room who actually got what you were building, and had continued, with escalating frequency, through 11 documented hotel stays, 3 of which had been billed. I confirmed through the credit card statements I already had full access to as a joint account holder, directly to Ashford Meridian Group as client entertainment. There was a message sent 9 weeks earlier that I have never told anyone the exact wording of, and I'm not going to tell you either, because some things belong only to the person who read them at 6 a.m., standing barefoot in her own kitchen. I will tell you this much. It confirmed that Chelsea knew about the trust withdrawals. Not the mechanics, she wasn't sophisticated enough to understand mechanics. And to her limited credit, several later messages showed a woman who seemed to genuinely believe Brad's version, that it was just moving money between accounts we already have access to. It's not like it's illegal. But she knew. She knew there was money moving that I didn't know about, and she had decided, 14 months into an affair with a married man, 12 years her senior, who controlled her paycheck, her performance reviews, and, as I would later confirm, a golden handcuffs bonus structure that vested only if she stayed through Meridian Row's completion, that this was a risk worth taking in exchange for a corner office promotion Brad had verbally promised her and never once put in writing, because, and this detail when I found it was the closest I came in the entire investigation to feeling something other than clinical, Brad Ashford does not put promises in writing when he doesn't intend to keep them. I would know. I had, at that point, found 4 of mine. I want to take you through the next 6 weeks in real time, because this is the part of the story where I had to become someone I don't think I'd ever fully let myself be before. A woman who could sit across a dinner table from 4 people actively working against her and pass every single one of their tests without blinking. The first test was Diane's, and it came on a Thursday, 11 days after Aspen, at what she still insisted on calling family dinner, even though the only 2 people who reliably attended anymore were Brad and me, dragged there every second week by an obligation neither of us had ever questioned out loud. Diane had redone the dining room again. She redoes it roughly every 18 months, always in a way that costs somewhere between $12,000 and $20,000. Always paid for, I now knew with total certainty, out of the same household account Grant liked to raid. And she opened the evening, over a first course of seared scallops she'd had catered, because Diane does not cook, has never cooked, considers cooking a thing other people's mothers do, with a question aimed directly at me. "Vanessa," she said, in the specific bright, brittle voice she uses when she's decided to address something without actually addressing it. "Walter and I were talking, and we really do think it would be best if we simply didn't discuss the unpleasantness at the airport again. It's not the kind of thing that reflects well on the family, and I'm sure it was all some sort of dreadful misunderstanding involving that girl. That girl." I noted it, Diane. Even now, even having presumably heard some version of the truth from Brad in a panicked late-night conversation I could only imagine, still reflexively protecting the family name over asking a single honest question about her own son's judgment. Or, for that matter, about why a 27-year-old employee had been packed into a family ski trip in the first place. I said, "Of course, Diane, whatever's best for the family," and watched her visibly relax, mistaking my compliance for the same weightless deference she'd trained me into for 9 years. Never once suspecting that I was simply choosing, deliberately, not to spend a single one of my cards on a Thursday dinner. Diane's fixed arrogance, I understood now, with the specificity of someone who had spent 6 weeks studying her family's finances line by line, wasn't actually confidence. It was a woman who had built her entire identity on being unquestionable, precisely because she could not survive being questioned. And I intended to be very, very patient about finding out exactly how true that was. Walter's test came the following week, over the same dining table, when he brought up, unprompted, a topic he had raised at least 6 times in the past 2 years, whether Castellano and Reyes might consider formalizing an arrangement with Ashford Meridian Group, doing their books officially, given the family connection. I had always declined, gently, citing conflict of interest rules that were completely real and that I had, frankly, thanked repeatedly over the years for giving me professional cover to keep Walter's hands off my client roster. This time, though, I said something different. I said I'd think about it. I watched Walter's face open with the particular satisfaction of a man who has just watched an obstacle remove itself, and I let him have that satisfaction for exactly as long as it took me to walk to my car afterward and call my father. Because what Walter had just done, without meaning to, was hand me a reason, a plausible, family-sanctioned reason, to request full access to Ashford Meridian Group's books, an access I would need, within the month, for something considerably more serious than an audit. Grant's test was, as always, the easiest, and the smallest, and somehow the one that told me the most. He caught me alone in Diane's kitchen 2 weeks after the dinner, refilling a wine glass he had not asked permission to refill from a bottle that was not his, and asked, in the low, conspiratorial voice he uses when he wants something, whether I'd heard anything about whatever's going on with Brad's project, because he'd been thinking, he said, that once Meridian Row closed, there might be an opportunity for him to come on as some kind of brand consultant, a role that did not exist, that he was not qualified for, and that he had clearly already decided, in his own head, came with a salary. I told him I hadn't heard anything specific. This was again the closest thing to a lie I allowed myself in this entire process, and I told it easily, because by that point I had stopped feeling any obligation at all to hand this family accurate information about anything. The reason I needed 6 weeks, the reason this couldn't happen the moment I found the forged guarantee in my closet, was that I was building 3 things simultaneously, and all 3 needed to be finished before I could move. The first was the evidentiary record itself. Every wire transfer, every forged signature, every hotel folio, organized into a binder, my father, only half joking, started calling the Ashford file, the way he used to talk about cases at the U.S. Attorney's Office, complete with an index, exhibit tabs, and a narrative summary written in the same clean, unemotional prose I use for every forensic report I've ever delivered to a client. The second was legal protection, not just for me personally, but for Castellano and Reyes, because a fraudulently pledged personal guarantee, even one I hadn't signed, needed to be formally voided before Cascade Bridge Capital could ever attempt to enforce it against my firm's assets. And that required a lawyer considerably more aggressive than anyone I'd ever needed before. That lawyer was Renata Vance, and I want to tell you about the first time I met her, because I think it tells you almost everything you need to know about the next phase of this story. Renata Vance is 54 years old, 5'2" in flats, and somehow the most physically imposing person in any room she enters, and runs a boutique family law and complex asset litigation practice out of a converted townhouse in the Gold Coast that does not accept clients unless someone Renata already trusts vouches for them personally. In my case, my father, who had opposed her exactly once in a case 12 years earlier, lost, and had been recommending her to anyone who would listen ever since. Her firm's unofficial motto, which a former client had told me before I ever set foot in her office, was Renata doesn't do closure. Renata does leverage. I sat across from her mahogany desk on a Tuesday afternoon with my binder, and she read through the entire thing without a single interruption, which took 40 minutes, while I sat in total silence, and at the end of it she looked up at me and said the first words she'd spoken since "sit down." "You built this yourself?" I did. In 6 weeks? In 6 weeks. She closed the binder, folded her hands on top of it, and said, "Mrs. Ashford, I have been doing this for 29 years, and I want you to understand something before we go one step further. Most people who walk into my office are victims looking for someone to hand them justice. You are not that. You are already the most dangerous person in this entire situation, and my only job is to make sure the law catches up to what you've already built before your husband's family figures out what's coming and tries to bury it in a settlement with an NDA attached. She paused, and then she said the sentence I would think about for the rest of this entire ordeal, the sentence that became, in some ways, the whole engine of the plan I had not yet fully assembled. The only mistake you could possibly make from here is letting this happen quietly. The third thing I was building, the one I hadn't told Renata about yet, hadn't told my father about yet, had told absolutely no one about, was the audience. I want to explain what I mean by that, because I think it's the piece of this story that separates what I actually did from what a more ordinary kind of anger would have led me to do. A quieter, more conventional version of me could have taken everything in that binder to Renata, filed for divorce, exposed the fraud in a courtroom, and won. I have no doubt I would have won. The evidence was that clean. But a courtroom is a room with a judge, 2 lawyers, a court reporter, and, on a good day, a handful of bored spectators. It is not a room with witnesses who matter to the Ashford family's actual currency, which was never money, not really. The money had been gone for years, hollowed out and refilled with debt long before I ever came along. Their currency was reputation, standing. The specific social oxygen that comes from being the family whose invitations people accept, whose name goes on the hospital wing plaque, whose 70th birthday gets a 4-page spread of RSVPs from a guest list Diane had spent 11 months curating. I understood, with the same clean clarity I bring to a balance sheet, that the only punishment that would actually register with these 4 people, the only one proportional to 9 years of being treated as furniture with a checkbook, was one that happened in front of every single person whose good opinion they had spent their entire lives performing for. Which meant I needed an event. And as it happened, I already knew exactly which one. Ashford Meridian Group had, for 8 months, been planning the grand opening gala for Meridian Row, the very project the fraud had been built to finance, the one Brad had gambled my family's money on, the one that, I now knew from the Cascade Bridge Capital loan file, was 91 days from a default that would trigger foreclosure on the personal guarantee if the remaining 41 units didn't pre-sell by the closing deadline. Diane had already booked the caterer, Walter had already drafted and revised 4 times a speech about 3 generations of the Ashford legacy. 640 invitations had already gone out, addressed to investors, city officials, the Ashford family's entire social circle, and, because Diane had insisted, over Brad's mild objection, that appearances matter, and a happily married son photographs so much better than a divorced one, to me, as Brad's wife, seated at the head table, in a role I had not yet told a single one of them I had absolutely no intention of playing quietly. If you've made it this far, I need you to do something for me before I tell you what happened next, because the next part of this story is the part where the walls actually start coming down, and I want as many of you watching live for it as possible. If you've ever sat at a family dinner table smiling at people who were quietly working against you the entire time, hit that subscribe button right now and tell me in the comments how long you held the smile before you let it drop. I promise you, mine lasted considerably longer than anyone in that dining room ever gave me credit for. The 41 days between that Thursday dinner and the Meridian Row Gala were, on the surface, the most ordinary period of my entire marriage. I want to describe them to you in some detail, because I think the strangest part of living a double life, and by that point, that's exactly what I was doing, is how boring it looks from the outside while it's happening. I still made coffee every morning at 6:15, still walked Ledger down Hoyne Avenue past the same 6 houses with the same 6 dogs who barked at him through the same 6 fences, still went to my office on North LaSalle and closed out 2 entirely unrelated client engagements, one involving a Naperville dental practice's embezzling office manager, and one involving a downstate grain co-op's missing insurance proceeds, both of which I handled with what my associate Priya later told me was scary good focus, not knowing that I was, in fact, using those cases as a kind of ballast, a way to keep my hands moving on problems I could actually solve cleanly, while the much larger problem sitting in my own house stayed exactly where I'd left it, contained, monitored, unconfronted. Brad, for his part, spent those 6 weeks in a state I can only describe as a controlled unraveling. He lost weight he didn't have to lose. He started sleeping in the guest room some nights, claiming he didn't want to disturb me with his phone calls, which I understood by then meant calls with Cascade Bridge Capital's increasingly impatient servicing department, or with Chelsea, who I had confirmed through 4 more mornings of unlocked phone reconnaissance was pressing him. With escalating anxiety of her own, about whether the misunderstanding at the airport had left any kind of record that could affect her ability to pass a background check for the state bar exam she was apparently, separately from her role as his executive assistant, quietly studying for at night, a detail that struck me, when I found it, as the single most human thing I learned about Chelsea Monroe in the entire investigation, that underneath the affair and the opportunism, she had actually been trying to build something of her own, and had simply decided that riding on the coattails of a married man's collapsing company was a faster way to get there than doing it herself. I did not feel sorry for her, I want to be honest about that, but I understood her a little better, and understanding, I've found, doesn't require forgiveness. It just makes the whole picture sharper. The moment that closed Loop B, the personal betrayal, the piece of this story that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with what 9 years is actually worth, came 17 days before the gala, on a Tuesday evening, and it did not come from me digging. It came, almost anticlimactically, from Chelsea herself. I was leaving my office later than usual, close to 8, when my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer it. I'm still not entirely sure why I did. The voice on the other end was Chelsea's, thinner than I remembered it from the one holiday party, and she said, without any preamble at all, "I know this is insane, and I know you probably hate me, but I need to tell you something, because I don't think Brad is ever going to, and I can't be part of whatever this is anymore." I stood on the sidewalk outside my own office building, in the cold, and I listened to Chelsea Monroe tell me things I already knew, in a voice cracking with a kind of guilt I don't think Brad had ever once demonstrated in 6 weeks of watching him unravel. She told me about the affair, 14 months, she confirmed, matching my own timeline exactly. She told me Brad had promised her a promotion to Director of Business Development that had never once appeared in an actual offer letter, promised her a percentage of Meridian Row's eventual profits that existed nowhere in writing, promised her, 3 separate times over the past year, that he was going to leave me as soon as things stabilized. A phrase, she said, her voice catching, that she'd started to realize was doing a lot of very convenient work for a man who never once let anything actually stabilize. And then she told me the thing I hadn't found yet, the thing that closed a loop I hadn't even known was still fully open. Brad had asked her, 4 days before the Aspen trip, whether she thought security would search an outside bag versus a spouse's bag more thoroughly, framing it, she said, as an idle question about TSA policy for an unrelated work trip. She hadn't understood what he meant until the moment her own name was called over that intercom, and in the 11 seconds it took her to walk to the secondary screening table, she told me she had understood, with total and sickening clarity, that the man she had spent 14 months blowing up her own life for had, without a single second thought, been willing to let his wife get arrested at an airport to buy himself room to maneuver, and that whatever twisted, unpredictable turn of fate had put that bag in her tote instead of mine, it had also just shown her, in the clearest possible terms, exactly what she was actually worth to him. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel better," Chelsea said near the end of the call, and there was something almost steady in her voice for the first time. "I'm telling you because I think you deserve to know exactly what kind of man you're dealing with, and because I think I do too." I thanked her. I meant it, in the strange, complicated way you can mean gratitude towards someone who spent over a year helping dismantle your marriage. I did not tell her what I already knew about the money. That would have been its own kind of unnecessary cruelty, and besides, I had already learned, over 6 weeks of careful silence, that the version of me who withheld information until the exact right moment was considerably more useful than the version who spent it too early out of spite. I did tell her one thing, though, before I hung up, that if she was serious about the bar exam, she should find herself a very good lawyer of her own, immediately, because whatever was coming for Brad was not going to be gentle, and whatever paper trail existed connecting her to the trust withdrawals, even unknowingly, was about to become extremely relevant to people who did not care about her intentions, only her signature. I hung up the phone on that sidewalk and stood there for a long moment in the cold, and this is the second time, the only other time in this entire story, that I let myself cry, quietly, for maybe 90 seconds. Not for Brad, and not even entirely for myself, but for the 9 years I had spent building a life around a foundation that, it turned out, had never once been load-bearing. Then I called Renata Vance, told her what Chelsea had said, and asked her to start drafting the divorce filing that afternoon, sealed, unfiled, ready to be entered into the court record the exact moment I gave the word. Loop A closed 9 days later, and it closed with considerably more institutional weight behind it, because by then my father had done something I hadn't explicitly asked him to do, but had absolutely hoped he would. He had made 2 phone calls to 2 former colleagues, one still at the U.S. Attorney's Office and one now senior in the FBI's Chicago Field Office Financial Crimes Squad, a woman named Special Agent Priscilla Odom, whom he'd worked 3 major cases with over the years, and trusted, he told me, the way you trust someone who's seen you at your worst on a wiretap and never once used it against you personally. Agent Odom met with me directly, in a conference room at the federal building on Dearborn that I will remember for the rest of my life, mostly for how cold it was, and reviewed my binder for 2.5 hours, occasionally asking a question so precise it told me, more than anything else could have, that she had done this exact kind of review hundreds of times before. At the end of it, she leaned back in her chair, looked at me for a long moment, and said, "Mrs. Ashford, I want to be direct with you. Wire fraud, forged notarization, unauthorized use of trust assets across state lines, given the Lake Geneva transactions. This is a clean case. It's cleaner than most of what walks through our door with 3 agents and a subpoena behind it already. The only reason I'd hesitate at all is that you built this alone, in 6 weeks, without a badge, and I need you to understand that from this point forward, if you want us involved, you don't get to run this anymore. We do. Can you live with that?" I told her I could. I meant it more than I think she initially believed, because what Agent Odom didn't yet understand, what I hadn't told her, because it wasn't relevant to the criminal case and I needed it to stay that way, was that I had never actually wanted to run the criminal case. I wanted the FBI's timeline to intersect, at the exact right moment, with a stage I was building entirely separately, one that had nothing to do with search warrants and everything to do with 640 engraved invitations. "There's one thing," I told her, before I left that cold conference room, "I need to know your timeline. Not the details. I understand I don't get those. Just a window." Agent Odom studied me for a long moment, the way I imagine she studies everyone who asks her a question shaped like that, and then she said, "Given the evidence you've handed us, and given the flight risk profile once he understands what's coming, I'd expect movement within 4 to 6 weeks." The Meridian Row Gala was scheduled for 5 weeks and 2 days later. I did not tell her that detail meant anything to me. I simply thanked her, shook her hand, and walked out of the federal building into a gray Chicago afternoon feeling, for the first time in 9 years, like every single piece on the board was finally sitting exactly where I needed it to be. I want to go back and give you 3 more scenes from those 5 weeks before I take you to the gala itself, because I think you need to see the second half of each of these 4 people's fixed patterns. The half that confirmed, beyond any doubt, that nothing about who they were had changed even as the walls closed in around all of us. The second Diane scene happened at a fitting. She had insisted, over my mild objection, on accompanying me to select a gown for the gala. "It's a reflection on the whole family, Vanessa. We simply cannot have you looking like you dressed yourself in the dark," she'd said, a sentence I found almost funny in retrospect, given that I would, in fact, be dressing myself with more intention that evening than I had ever dressed for anything in my entire life. We went to a boutique on Oak Street that Diane favored, and she spent 40 minutes rejecting 6 different gowns on my behalf before the 7th. A deep emerald column dress with a structured shoulder that the saleswoman, a patient woman named Odalise, who I made a point of tipping generously afterward, had actually pulled, specifically because she thought it suited my coloring, finally met with Diane's approval, though approval, from Diane, always arrived wrapped in a small diminishment, the way it always had. "There," she said, looking at me in the 3-way mirror the way you'd look at a piece of furniture you were finally satisfied with. "Now you'll photograph properly next to Brad. Not I look beautiful, not this suits you." A structural assessment of how well I would function as a backdrop for her son. I bought the dress. I did not tell her that I had, 3 days earlier, already had a second, entirely different gown altered at a different boutique across town. A deep, uncompromising black, structured to move easily, chosen specifically for a night I intended to spend on my feet, and that the emerald dress from Oak Street would never once leave its garment bag. The second Walter scene happened over golf, which Walter had insisted with characteristic obliviousness to whether I actually wanted to spend a Saturday morning that way, that we needed to do man-to-man, well, you know what I mean, before the gala, to discuss the family's expectations. What Walter actually wanted, it turned out over 4 holes of a course in Winnetka I had no genuine interest in, was to inform me, with the specific mix of grandiosity and total blindness to irony that defined every conversation I'd ever had with him, that the gala represented the moment the Ashford name finally gets its due after 20 years of being underestimated by people who don't understand real legacy, and that my role, as his son's wife, was to look the part and let the men handle the business conversations, a directive he delivered while standing on land his own construction company had once developed, and then, according to public records I had pulled purely out of professional curiosity 2 weeks earlier, lost in a foreclosure 11 years ago that Walter had never once mentioned to anyone in the family, having instead simply told everyone the land had been sold at the right time. I smiled at him on that fourth green and I said, "Of course, Walter. I understand exactly what my role is." And I meant it with a level of precision he could not have possibly imagined, because by that point I understood my role at the gala with more clarity than any of them, including Brad, including possibly even myself 2 months earlier. The second grant scene was, characteristically, about money, though this time it was money moving toward me rather than through me. Grant called 3 days before the gala at 11 p.m., a time that told me exactly how the conversation would go before he'd said a single word, and asked, without any preamble, whether I could front him $4,000 for a suit and some other stuff for the gala, promising, with the specific weightlessness of a man who has never once had to make good on a promise like this, that he'd pay me back once the Meridian Row units start closing. I told him no. It was the first time in 9 years I had told Grant no to his face, and the silence on the other end of the line lasted a full 4 seconds before he said, in a tone somewhere between wounded and confused, "Wow, okay. Didn't realize you'd gotten so, I don't know, tight lately." As though $4,000 handed to a 34-year-old man with no job and no plan to repay it was a reasonable baseline expectation that I had suddenly, inexplicably, failed to meet. I told him I hoped he found something nice to wear regardless, and I hung up, and I sat in my kitchen afterward with Ledger's head on my foot and felt, for the first time in this entire process, something that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite grief, but sat somewhere adjacent to both, the specific, quiet loneliness of realizing that not one of these 4 people, across 9 years and hundreds of hours in each other's company, had ever once asked me a question about my own life that wasn't secretly a question about what I could provide. The preparation for the gala itself, on my end, took considerably more coordination than a dress fitting. Renata Vance and I met 4 times in the final 2 weeks, twice with Agent Odom present by phone, working through what Renata called the sequencing problem, the delicate, legally precise choreography of making sure the divorce filing, the trust's emergency injunction freezing further disbursements, and the FBI's own timeline for executing a search warrant on Ashford Meridian Group's offices did not collide with each other in a way that would let Brad's lawyers, once he inevitably hired some, claim any of it had been coordinated in bad faith or timed for maximum public humiliation rather than legitimate legal necessity. "Here's what I need you to understand," Renata told me. "In our final meeting, 4 days before the gala, everything up to and including the moment federal agents walk into that room has to be defensible as ordinary process moving at its own ordinary pace. The optics of it landing on gala night, that's not something either of us is allowed to engineer. That has to look like exactly what it actually is, a case that happened to reach its natural conclusion on a Saturday in October, and nothing more." I understood what she was telling me, and I want to be honest with you about how I heard it, because I think it matters for how you understand everything that happens next. She was right, legally. I never once asked Agent Odom to time anything. I never once told Renata to file anything on a specific date for effect. What I had done, the only thing I had actually engineered, in the entire architecture of this plan, was ensure that I personally knew, to within a reasonably confident window, when a case that was already moving at its own institutional pace was likely to reach the point of execution, and I had simply, quietly, declined to do anything that might slow that pace down, and had, with equal quietness, made absolutely certain that I would be standing in the one room in Chicago where its arrival would matter most. Brad, in those final days, seemed to sense something shifting without being able to name it. He asked me, twice, whether I was okay, a question I don't think he'd asked with any real curiosity in over a year, and both times I told him I was fine, just tired from work. A lie so ordinary and so thoroughly unremarkable that he accepted it without a second thought. The way he had accepted, for 9 years, the idea that his wife's inner life was simply not a topic that required his active attention. 3 nights before the gala, he came into the kitchen while I was making tea and stood there for a long moment watching me, and said, in a voice that had lost almost all of the confident, room-filling charm I'd first fallen for 9 years earlier. Whatever happens with all this, V, I need you to know I never meant for any of it to touch you. I looked at him, really looked at him, the way I hadn't let myself in weeks, and saw, underneath the exhaustion and the fear I now understood was mostly about his own exposure rather than any genuine remorse about mine, a man who still, even now, 4 days from what I knew was coming, believed that intention was a kind of currency that could offset the actual, documented, six-figure damage of what he'd done. It already touched me, Brad, I said, and I meant it as simply and factually as I meant everything else I'd said to him in 6 weeks. It touched me the morning you put something in my bag at an airport. I watched that land. I watched him understand, for the first time maybe in the entire conversation, that I knew, not suspected, knew, with the specific certainty of someone who had never once actually needed him to confess it to her. And I watched him decide, in real time, not to ask me how much more I knew, because some part of him, I think, had already understood that the answer would be worse than anything he was prepared to hear 4 days before the biggest night of his professional life. The morning of the gala, I woke up at 5:30. Before my alarm, in the guest room I had quietly started sleeping in myself 2 weeks earlier under the same unremarkable cover story Brad had used months before. Work stress, wanting to not disturb him. And I lay there in the dark for 11 minutes doing something I hadn't done since the night I found the forged trust document. I let myself feel, completely and without editing, exactly how frightened I was. I want to say this plainly, because I think the revenge story version of these narratives sometimes forgets to include it, and I don't want to leave you with the impression that any of what I did came from a place of pure, cold confidence. It didn't. I was frightened that Renata's sequencing could still collide badly. I was frightened that Agent Odom's window of 4 to 6 weeks was an estimate and not a promise, and that I would stand in that ballroom that night having told no one. Not my sister, not my closest friend from business school, not a single person outside 3 professionals bound by privilege. What I was actually walking into, and nothing would happen at all, and I would simply have to go home afterward and keep living inside a marriage I had already completely finished grieving. I was frightened, underneath all of it, of a much smaller and more human thing, that somewhere in that ballroom, watching Brad's family finally answer for what they'd built, I would feel nothing that resembled the relief I'd been promising myself for 6 weeks, only the plain, unglamorous grief of watching something that used to be your whole life end in front of 600 strangers. I let myself feel all of that for 11 minutes. Then I got up, made coffee, took Ledger for his walk past the same 6 houses and the same 6 dogs, and became, for the rest of the day, entirely and completely the version of myself that could not afford to feel any of it again until it was over. Renata called at 9 a.m. with an update she delivered in the clipped, efficient cadence she used for anything time-sensitive. The emergency injunction freezing the trust and Cascade Bridge Capital's ability to move against Castellano and Reyes's assets had been granted that morning by a judge Renata had, with characteristic thoroughness, made sure had a clean docket and no personal connection to anyone named Ashford. It would not be served on Brad until Monday, by design. Renata had structured the timing specifically so that nothing legally provable as retaliatory would land before the gala, protecting both the integrity of the injunction and, not incidentally, protecting me from any accusation that I had personally weaponized the court's timing against my own husband's biggest night. The document exists now, Renata told me. Whatever happens tonight, your money, your house, and your firm are protected as of 9:14 this morning. Everything else that happens today is entirely outside my control, and I want you to understand I am not telling you to do anything specific with that information. I understood exactly what she was telling me and exactly what she wasn't. Agent Odom's call came at 1 p.m., and it was shorter and considerably more careful, the way conversations with federal agents about active investigations tend to be. I can't give you operational details, she said, and I need you to not ask for them. What I can tell you, because it's a matter of basic professional courtesy given how much work you've put into this case, is that today is an active day for us. That's all I'm going to say, and I need you to not read more into it than that. I did not need to read more into it than that. I had spent 11 years reading exactly as much as people gave me, and not one drop more, and today is an active day told me everything I needed to know. I spent the afternoon at my office, closing out the last details of the grain co-op case, because I have learned, over 11 years, that the single most reliable way to steady my own hands before something enormous is to give them a smaller, solvable problem to hold on to first. Priya asked me, around 3, whether I was excited about the gala that evening. She knew, in the vague way my staff knew things, that my in-laws were opening some big real estate project. And I told her I was looking forward to it, in a voice so even and unremarkable that she went back to her own desk without a second thought. And I remember sitting there afterward, looking at the closed file on my screen, thinking that this exact, unremarkable exchange was probably the last completely ordinary conversation I was going to have for a very long time. I drove home at 4:30 and Brad was already there, dressed, pacing the length of our living room in a tuxedo that fit him. I noticed with a strange, detached clarity, slightly looser than it had 6 weeks earlier. He had lost, I would guess, close to 15 pounds since Aspen. He looked at me when I came in and said, with an attempt at his old warmth that didn't quite land, "You look beautiful." Though I hadn't changed into the emerald dress yet. I was still in the black dress I'd had altered separately, structured and unfamiliar to him, and I watched a small, confused flicker cross his face, the first tiny crack in a night that was about to be made almost entirely of them, though he didn't know it yet. "This isn't the dress your mother picked," he said. "No," I said, "it isn't." I did not explain further, and he did not push, because by that point Brad had learned, over 6 increasingly strange weeks, that pushing me on anything tended to open doors he wasn't prepared to walk through, and some instinct in him, the same instinct, I think, that had kept him from ever directly asking me how much I actually knew, told him this was not the night to start. We drove to the venue in near total silence, the same silence that had filled the car on the way home from O'Hare 6 weeks earlier, except that this time I was not staring out the window feeling the ground fall away beneath me. This time I sat with my hands folded in my lap, watching the city slide by, doing the thing I have done before every major case presentation of my career, running the sequence one final time, start to finish, checking every column, every row, every number, making sure it all still added up to 0. The Meridian Row Gala was held inside a restored rail terminal on the near west side that Ashford Meridian Group had licensed for the night at a cost of $51,000, a figure I knew precisely because I had, 4 days earlier, pulled the vendor contract myself, out of habit more than necessity at that point. 640 guests, a 12-piece band, a raw bar Diane had insisted on despite Walter's mild objection about cost, an objection Diane had overridden the way she overrode all of Walter's objections, by simply proceeding as though he hadn't made one. Floor-to-ceiling arched windows still fitted with the terminal's original ironwork, threw pale gold light across a room already half full of Chicago's specific brand of civic aristocracy. Aldermen, developers, a state senator I recognized from a fundraiser years earlier, a scattering of society page photographers stationed near the entrance the way they always are, waiting for exactly the kind of photograph none of us yet knew was coming. I walked in on Brad's arm at 6:52 p.m. in the black dress, and I felt every single person who mattered to the Ashford family's sense of themselves turn, briefly, to look at us, the golden couple, 9 years married, the wife who did something with numbers, the husband whose name was about to go up on a building. Diane intercepted us within 90 seconds, resplendent in ivory, already 3 glasses of champagne into an evening she had spent 11 months building toward, and said, looking me over with an expression that flickered, almost imperceptibly, into confusion at the unfamiliar dress before smoothing back into practiced warmth. "There you are. Everyone's dying to meet you both." Walter stood near the small stage at the far end of the room, rehearsing something under his breath to a functionary I didn't recognize, radiating the specific self-importance of a man 3 hours from the speech of his life. Grant was already at the bar, in a rented tuxedo I strongly suspected he had not paid for himself, laughing too loudly at something a woman half his age had said. I moved through the first hour of that room with a kind of dissociated precision I can only describe as professional. I shook hands, I smiled at the state senator and told him, truthfully, that his infrastructure bill had made an interesting case study for a client's tax position 2 years earlier. I let 3 separate people tell me, unprompted, how lucky Brad was to have such a sharp wife behind him, a phrase I heard variations of at least 5 times that night and filed away, silently, as exactly the kind of casual erasure I had spent 9 years absorbing without comment. I watched Chelsea Monroe arrive at 7:40, alone in a dress considerably more subdued than anything I'd seen her in before, and watched her make eye contact with me exactly once, across the room, a look that held something I read as both apology and warning, before she found a spot near the back, close to the exit, the posture of a woman who had already, in her own mind, halfway left the building. At 8:15, the band paused, the lights dimmed toward the small stage, and Walter Ashford stepped up to the microphone to deliver the speech he had revised 4 times, about 3 generations of legacy, about a family that had never once stopped building, even when this city doubted us. A line that drew warm, dutiful applause from a room full of people who had no idea that the land under Walter's very first development had been lost to foreclosure 11 years earlier, a fact he had spent a decade quietly erasing from his own version of the family story. I clapped along with everyone else. I want you to understand that I felt nothing false in that applause, because by that point I had made a kind of peace with the fact that Walter's fiction was simply the water this entire family had always swum in, and that peace, that specific, hard-won calm, was the only thing standing between me and the version of this night where I might have done something rash, 6 months earlier, before I'd built anything solid enough to survive contact with a courtroom. Brad spoke next, and here is where I want to slow down, because this is the part of the evening where the loop I had been carrying for 6 weeks began, finally, visibly, to come loose. He talked about vision. He talked about betting everything on Meridian Row, a phrase that landed, for me, with a very different and considerably more literal weight than it did for the 600 people applauding around me. He talked near the end about partnership, about how none of this happens without the people who believe in you when the numbers get hard. And I watched him glance toward me, briefly, a practiced beat clearly intended to invoke the loyal wife narrative Diane had been so invested in all evening, and I felt something in my chest go very still and very cold, because I understood, in that exact moment, standing in a rented tuxedo 3 hours from being served federal charges, that Brad Ashford still believed, even now, that he could simply narrate his way out of what was coming. The same way he had narrated his way through 9 years of a marriage he'd been quietly bleeding dry the entire time. He was midway through a sentence about the next chapter when the doors at the far end of the terminal opened. I felt it before I fully saw it. A change in the room's sound, a ripple moving backward from the entrance, the way water moves when something breaks its surface. 4 agents in plain dark suits, unhurried, unshowy, moving with the specific calm authority of people who had done this exact walk dozens of times before. Agent Priscilla Odom at the front of them, a folded document visible in her hand. The band, mid-song, faltered and stopped. 600 conversations died in stages, spreading outward from the door like a held breath. Brad saw them before he understood what he was seeing, the way you register a shape before your brain assigns it a name, and I watched, from 8 feet away, at the edge of the small stage, the exact moment his face made the connection. The same face I'd watched detach from itself at O'Hare 6 weeks earlier, except that this time there was nowhere to funnel the panic into a secondary screening table 20 feet away. This time the secondary screening table was the entire room. Bradford Ashford, Agent Odom's voice carried, flat and procedural, across a terminal built a century earlier to carry exactly this kind of acoustics. And 600 people who had come that night to watch a legacy be unveiled, instead watched Agent Priscilla Odom introduce herself, identify her office, and inform Bradford Ashford, in front of his parents, his brother, his mistress standing frozen near the back exit, and his wife standing 8 feet from the microphone he had just been speaking into, that he was being taken into custody in connection with wire fraud, the fraudulent transfer of trust assets across state lines, and forged notarization of financial instruments, and that anything he said could and would be used against him. I want to describe Diane's face in that moment, because I have turned it over in my memory more times than almost anything else from that night. She did not scream, she did not faint, despite what I think some small theatrical part of her had always assumed she would do in a crisis of this magnitude. She simply went very, very still, her champagne glass held at exactly the height she'd been holding it a second earlier, her eyes moving, slowly, from Brad to the agents to the 600 guests now watching with the specific hungry attention of people who understand they are witnessing something that will be talked about for years. And I watched. In real time, an entire lifetime of curated unquestionability collapse into a single, silent, public moment that no amount of Tuesday blowouts or 11 months planned guest lists would ever be able to fully erase from this city's memory. Walter, to his credit, or perhaps simply to his very specific brand of instinct, tried to speak. There has clearly been some kind of mistake. My son would never. And Agent Odom, without raising her voice at all, said, Mr. Ashford, I'd advise you not to make statements on your son's behalf in a room full of witnesses. A sentence that landed with the precise, surgical weight of a woman who had spent a career understanding exactly how much damage people did to themselves in the first 90 seconds after an arrest. And Walter, for possibly the first time in 9 years of family dinners, actually stopped talking. Grant, near the bar, had gone the color of the tablecloths, and Chelsea Monroe, near the back exit, made a choice in that moment that I have thought about many times since, because I think it revealed more about her than 14 months of hotel receipts ever did. She did not run. A second agent, moving quietly toward her, said something I couldn't hear from across the room, and Chelsea nodded, once, and walked toward him without protest, without tears, with the specific, deliberate posture of a woman who had already decided, sometime in the past 17 days since our phone call, that whatever consequences were coming for her, she intended to face them standing up rather than get caught trying to run from them, and I felt, watching her do that, something I hadn't expected to feel toward her at all, a small, complicated flicker of respect. Brad turned to me, in the 11 or 12 seconds before the agents moved him toward the door, and said my name, just my name, Vanessa, nothing else, in a voice that had finally, completely lost every trace of the charm that had first drawn me to him across a fundraiser bar 9 years earlier. And I looked at him, in front of 600 people, in front of his parents and his brother and the woman he'd betrayed me for, and I said the only thing I had actually planned to say that entire night, the one sentence I had rehearsed, quietly, in the dark, over 11 minutes at 5:30 that morning. You told me at the airport that you had no idea how that got in my bag. I let the silence hold for exactly as long as I needed it to. I want you to know that for 6 weeks I've had a very clear idea of exactly how everything got everywhere it needed to go. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I stood in that black dress, in the middle of a room full of witnesses, and I let 11 years of professional stillness carry every single word, and I watched Brad understand, in the last seconds before the agents led him out through the terminal's original iron doors, and into a night that would be photographed, gossiped about, and eventually written up in 3 separate Chicago publications, that the wife he had spent 9 years treating as furniture with a checkbook had, this entire time, been the one holding the pen. The 48 hours after the gala moved faster than anything else in this entire story, and I want to walk you through them before I take you to the part that happened months later, because I think the immediate aftermath tells you something the neat, tidy epilogue version often leaves out. That even a plan this carefully built doesn't end cleanly the moment the dramatic part is over. It just changes shape. By midnight, 3 separate Chicago outlets had some version of the story online, though none of them yet had my name attached to anything beyond the developer's wife, a detail I noticed with a kind of grim amusement, given how the exact same 600 guests who'd spent the earlier part of the evening telling me how lucky Brad was to have me, were now, according to a Crain's Chicago business reporter who called my office the following Monday looking for comment, describing me to anyone who'd listen as the woman who somehow knew, a phrase that would follow me, in various forms, through the entire 6 months that followed. Diane called me at 11 that night, 40 minutes after the agents left with Brad, her voice stripped of every ounce of the practiced warmth she'd used on me for 9 years, and said only, "What did you do?" Not as a question so much as an accusation dressed as one. And I told her, honestly, the only thing that was legally and personally true. I told the truth to people whose job it is to act on it. Everything else was your son's doing, Diane, and I think somewhere underneath all of this you already know that. She hung up without responding. We have not spoken since, and I want to tell you that this surprised me, but it didn't. Diane's entire architecture had always been built around never once having to sit with an uncomfortable truth about her own family. And I understood, standing in my kitchen at 11:40 that night with ledger pressed against my leg, that losing me as a daughter-in-law was, to Diane, a far more survivable loss than losing the story she'd told herself about who the Ashfords actually were. Walter's call came the next morning, considerably calmer, considerably more calculating, and considerably more revealing. He did not ask what I'd done. He asked, instead, whether I'd be willing to keep this contained to the family, a phrase that told me, more clearly than anything else that entire week, that even watching his son led out of a public gala in handcuffs, Walter's first instinct remained protecting the Ashford name, rather than understanding what his son had actually done to me. I told him, as gently as I could manage under the circumstances, that the containment he was asking for had stopped being an option the moment his son forged my signature, and moved my grandmother's money into a project built on a lie, and that if he was looking for someone to blame for the fact that this story would not stay quiet, he might consider starting with the person who had personally guaranteed it wouldn't, by putting cocaine in my luggage 6 weeks earlier. He did not call again. Grant never called at all. I found out later, through my father, who still had contacts who kept him casually informed, that Grant had left the gala that night and driven directly to his parents' house in Winnetka, where he stayed for the next 4 months. A detail I mention only because it tells you something essential about a person whose entire fixed trait, across 9 years, had been the quiet assumption that someone else would always absorb the consequences of his life. When the family that had always absorbed them for him suddenly had considerably less capacity to keep doing so, Grant did not adapt. He simply waited, the way he always had, for the ground to become solid again under someone else's effort. Chelsea Monroe, I learned from Renata a week later, had retained her own lawyer within 18 hours of the gala, cooperated fully and immediately with Agent Odom's team, and had, through that cooperation, avoided any criminal exposure of her own beyond an agreement to testify, given that the evidence showed clearly she had not known the specific mechanics of the trust fraud, only that money had been moving in ways Brad hadn't fully explained. I want to tell you I felt satisfaction at this outcome. What I actually felt was something quieter and more complicated. A kind of relief that at least one person inside this entire wreckage had chosen, when it mattered, to tell the truth rather than protect the story, even if it had taken her 14 months and one very frightening morning at an airport to get there. I want to tell you about the arraignment too before I take you to the 11-month mark, because it happened only 9 days after the gala, faster than I expected. And it was the first time I saw Brad in a courtroom rather than a ballroom, and I think the contrast between those two rooms taught me something I hadn't fully understood until I was sitting in the second one. The arraignment was held on a Tuesday morning, in a courtroom considerably more crowded than I expected, mostly with reporters who had picked up the story after a Tribune piece ran 3 days earlier under a headline I will not repeat here, because I have never once wanted to be defined by a headline written by someone who wasn't in that room. Brad appeared in a plain gray suit, no tie, flanked by his newly retained defense attorney, and I watched him scan the gallery when he was brought in, searching, I understood immediately, for his parents' faces, and finding only my father's, and mine, seated 4 rows back, and Renata beside us, taking notes on a legal pad out of habit even though nothing that morning required it. The magistrate judge read the charges aloud in the flat procedural cadence judges use for exactly this purpose: wire fraud, twice, making false statements to a federally insured institution, a count of aggravated identity theft tied specifically to the forged notarization bearing my name. And I watched Brad's face do something I hadn't seen it do even at the gala, something closer to genuine, unrehearsed fear, because I think it was in that courtroom, hearing the actual language of the actual charges read into an actual federal record, that he finally understood this was no longer a crisis that charm, or a good lawyer, or his family's name could talk its way around. Bail was set at $250,000, secured, ultimately, against what remained of Walter and Diane's equity in the Winnetka house, a detail I only learned later and that struck me, when I did, as a strange and fitting kind of symmetry, that the same instrument, home equity, that Brad had used without authorization to fund his own fraud, was now the only thing standing between him and a jail cell while the case moved forward. Borrowed this time, not stolen, but borrowed from parents who I suspect, even then, still believed some version of the story where this was all a misunderstanding that would resolve itself before it ever truly cost them anything. Renata leaned over to me as the hearing wrapped and the gallery began to shift and murmur, and said quietly, "This is the part most people don't see. The gala was the visible collapse. This room is where the actual structure of consequence gets built, brick by brick, hearing by hearing, and it is considerably less dramatic and considerably more permanent." I have thought about that sentence often in the 2 years since, because I think it's true of almost everything in this story. The visible moments, the airport, the gala, make for a better narrative, but the actual justice, the actual accounting, happened in rooms like that arraignment courtroom, quiet, procedural, and entirely unglamorous, exactly the way the best forensic work always is. Diane did not attend the arraignment. Walter did, seated near the back, silver-haired and visibly diminished, refusing eye contact with either my father or me for the entire 40 minutes. And Grant did not come at all, a small, unremarkable absence that told me, even then, 9 days out from the gala, exactly how this family intended to handle the next several months. Not together, not as a united front the way Diane had always insisted the Ashford name required, but scattered, each of them quietly beginning the long process of deciding how much of this collapse they were willing to be seen standing next to. A process that, I would learn over the following 11 months, none of them would ultimately navigate together, not even once. 11 months have passed since that night in the rail terminal, and I want to tell you where everyone actually ended up, because I think the specific shape of consequences matters more than the vague satisfaction of knowing justice was served. Brad pleaded guilty, 4 months after his arrest, to wire fraud and 1 count of making false statements to a federally insured financial institution, a plea Renata helped negotiate down from the original indictment specifically by making sure the government understood the full scope of restitution available, through the frozen trust and Ashford Meridian Group's remaining assets. He was sentenced to 31 months in a federal facility downstate and ordered to pay restitution of $409,000. The exact figure my 6-week investigation had traced dollar for dollar. He wrote me 1 letter 3 months into his sentence, which I read once, standing at my own kitchen counter, and did not answer. I am not going to tell you what it said. Some things, even at the end of a story like this one, are allowed to stay mine alone. Meridian Row itself was never completed under the Ashford name. Cascade Bridge Capital foreclosed on the property 4 months after the gala. Once it became clear the personal guarantee tying my firm's assets to the loan had been formally voided by the court as a product of fraud, and the 11 half-finished units sat behind a chain-link fence in Pilsen for the better part of a year before a different developer, with no connection to the Ashford family at all, purchased the lot at auction and finished the project under a different name. I drove past it once, around month 7, purely by accident, on my way to a client meeting, and felt, looking at the finished building with someone else's signage on it, almost nothing at all, which was, I think, its own kind of answer to a question I hadn't realized I was still quietly asking myself. Walter Ashford's public reputation, the thing he had spent 70 years building and had, in his own mind, been about to finally cement with the Meridian Row Gala, did not survive the stories spread through Chicago's real estate and civic circles. The Sun-Times ran a piece, 5 weeks after the gala, tracing Ashford Construction's actual financial history back 2 decades. Including the foreclosure Walter had spent 11 years quietly erasing from every version of the family story he told. And the coverage was, by every account I heard secondhand, deeply unkind in the specific way that only genuinely accurate reporting about a carefully maintained fiction can be. Walter resigned from 2 civic boards within the year, not because anyone forced him to, but because, according to my father, who still hears things through channels I've stopped asking about, the invitations to the events those boards hosted simply stopped including him, one quiet omission at a time, until the omission became its own kind of verdict. Diane, as far as I know, still lives in the same house in Winnetka, still redoes the same dining room on the same 18-month cycle. Though I understand from a mutual acquaintance who mentioned it to me at a professional event I hadn't expected to run into her at, that the guest list for anything Diane hosts now runs considerably shorter than it used to, and that at least a dozen of the 640 people who received an invitation to the Meridian Row Gala have, in the specific unspoken way old money and near old money Chicago handles these things, quietly stopped returning her calls. I do not know if Diane has ever once, in 11 months, asked herself an honest question about her own role in any of what happened. I suspect, based on 9 years of watching her, that she has not. And I have made my peace with the fact that some people simply never do. Grant moved out of his parents' guest suite 6 months after the gala, not because he found a job, he did not, as far as anyone has told me, but because Walter and Diane, facing considerably reduced circumstances of their own after the restitution judgment and the collapse of what remained of Ashford Meridian Group's value, finally, for the first time in 34 years, told him they could no longer subsidize an adult son with no income and no plan. I heard, through the same mutual acquaintance, that Grant is currently living with a girlfriend in Rogers Park and has, apparently, taken a job, an actual job, with an actual W-2, at a mid-sized logistics company, a detail that struck me, when I heard it, as the single strangest piece of good news to come out of this entire story, though I suspect it had considerably less to do with any genuine change of character, and considerably more to do with the simple, brutal mathematics of no longer having anyone left to absorb the cost of not changing. Chelsea Monroe passed the Illinois bar exam 8 months after the gala, on her second attempt, having failed the first sitting, which fell 3 weeks after Brad's arrest, by a margin her own lawyer described to Renata as the kind of miss that happens when your entire life is on fire. She works now, I'm told, at a small consumer protection legal aid clinic on the South Side. A job that pays, I would guess, somewhere around a third of what she could earn at a private firm, and I think about that sometimes. A woman who spent 14 months trying to fast-track herself into a life she thought Brad Ashford's money and influence could hand her, ending up, instead, in a job built entirely around the kind of institutional accountability that the entire Ashford family had spent generations avoiding. I don't know if she'd call that irony. I do. As for me, Castellano and Reyes added 4 new clients in the 6 months following the gala. 3 of them referrals from people who had been at the terminal that night and had, apparently, decided that a forensic accountant who could uncover this level of fraud inside her own marriage was exactly the kind of forensic accountant they wanted looking at their company's books. I finalized my divorce from Brad 5 months after the gala, a process Renata handled with the same brisk efficiency she brought to everything, and I kept the house on Hoyne Avenue, the one I had personally paid down $81,000 of principal on over 6 years. Free and clear, the equity line that had funded Meridian Row, discharged as part of the restitution settlement. My grandmother's trust, restored in full plus interest through the civil judgment Renata secured, now funds, among other things, a scholarship at a community college in Cicero for first-generation students studying accounting, because I decided, somewhere around month 3 of all of this, that the thing I actually wanted to do with money that had once been stolen and lied about was put it somewhere it could never again be, quietly, forgibly, taken from someone who had no idea, yet, how much they were worth. I still walk Ledger past the same 6 houses every morning. I still make tea at my kitchen island some nights, though these days it's less often at 2 a.m. with a spreadsheet glowing in front of me and more often just because I like the quiet. I think, sometimes, about the version of myself who sat frozen on that closet floor for 51 minutes with a forged document in her lap, and I don't feel sorry for her, exactly, but I do feel something like tenderness toward her, toward a woman who had spent 9 years being so careful, so quietly competent, so willing to let an entire family mistake her stillness for smallness, and who had, underneath all of it, simply been waiting for the one moment when stillness would finally be the most dangerous thing in the room. If there's a lesson in any of this, and I've had 11 months now to sit with whether there is one, I don't think it's the one people usually reach for. The one about never trusting anyone, about keeping your guard up forever. I think the actual lesson is smaller and quieter than that the people who underestimate you are almost always telling you, plainly, exactly how much attention they've paid to who you really are, and that the correct response to being underestimated is very rarely to prove them wrong loudly. It's to let them keep believing whatever lets them sleep at night, right up until the moment the math simply stops adding up in their favor. Every liar I have ever investigated in 11 years of doing this work has made the same fundamental miscalculation. They assume that because no one is saying anything, no one is watching. I would like to ask you something. Watching this right now, whoever you are, wherever you're sitting, how many people in your own life have made that exact same mistake about you? I want to go back further before any of this and tell you about the 9 years underneath the 6 weeks, because I think you can't fully understand why I was capable of doing what I did unless you understand exactly how long I had been quietly, invisibly cataloging the small warning signs I'd chosen, for 9 years, to file away rather than act on. The first one came 8 months into our marriage, when Brad asked me, over dinner at a restaurant I remember specifically because it was the same one where he'd proposed, whether I'd consider putting his name on the deed to the small 2-flat I'd bought at 26, with money I'd saved from 4 years of 80-hour weeks building my firm from nothing. I said no, gently, citing the same conflict of interest instincts that had always protected me professionally, and Brad had laughed it off, called it just a thought, and never brought it up again, and I had filed the moment away as a small, forgivable overreach rather than what I now understand it actually was. An early test, run quietly, to see how much access I would grant without asking hard questions. The second came 2 years in, when I discovered, entirely by accident while reconciling our joint tax return, that Brad had listed consulting income from Ashford Meridian Group at a figure roughly 40% higher than what actually appeared in the company's bank statements I had, as his wife and an accountant he trusted implicitly with our joint filings, full access to. When I asked him about the discrepancy, he told me it was just aggressive tax planning. Everyone in real estate does it. A phrase I would hear, in various forms, at least 6 more times over the following 7 years, each time attached to some new inconsistency I had noticed, and, each time, quietly decided not to escalate, because escalating would have meant admitting, to myself, that the man I had married treated the truth as a variable to be optimized rather than a fixed constant, the way I had been trained, since I was 19 years old in my grandmother's kitchen, to believe it always had to be. The third, and the one I think about most now, came 4 years in, at a dinner with Walter and Diane, where Walter had, in front of the whole table, made an offhand comment about how lucky Brad was that Meridian Row's early land acquisition had worked out. A comment that made no sense to me at the time, because I didn't yet understand the specific financial arrangement it was quietly referencing. And that I only understood fully 11 years later, sitting in that cold conference room with Agent Odom, as an early, family-blessed instance of exactly the kind of financial maneuvering that would eventually consume $291,000 of my grandmother's trust. I did not act on any of these signs across 9 years, and I want to be honest about why, because I think the honesty matters more than the flattering revenge story ending. I did not act because I loved him, in the ordinary, unglamorous way you love someone you've built a life with. Not a grand cinematic love, but the kind built out of 1,000 small mornings, a beagle mix named Ledger we'd chosen together at a shelter in Elmhurst, a decade of Sunday crosswords and shared jokes about his mother's dinner parties. I did not act because some part of me, the same part that had grown up watching my own mother stretch a schoolteacher's salary across every possible need without ever once complaining, had learned early that loyalty meant absorbing friction quietly rather than demanding accountability loudly. And I did not act, if I'm being completely honest with you, because some part of me was afraid of exactly what I eventually discovered. That if I ever actually opened the ledger on my own marriage the way I opened one on every other collapsing institution that walked through my office door, I would find precisely the kind of rot I'd built an entire career on finding in other people's lives, and I would have to admit that I had been living, for years, inside the exact kind of fiction I had spent my whole professional life teaching other people how to see through. The person who finally made me stop filing things away was, in a strange and roundabout way, my grandmother, or more specifically, the memory of her, sitting at that same Cicero kitchen table 20 years earlier, teaching a 19-year-old girl how a ledger works. She used to say, and I heard this phrase probably 200 times growing up, in the specific patient, unhurried Spanish she used whenever she wanted something to really land. Todo tiene que cuadrar, mija. Si no cuadra, algo está mal, y no importa cuánto tiempo tardes en encontrarlo. Everything has to balance, my girl. If it doesn't balance, something is wrong, and it doesn't matter how long it takes you to find it. I thought about that sentence constantly during those 6 weeks, sitting at my own kitchen island at 2 a.m., because I understood, finally, at 38 years old, that I had spent 9 years watching a marriage that quietly, persistently, did not balance, and telling myself that loyalty meant refusing to ask why. My sister, Lucia, 3 years younger than me and living in Denver with a husband and 2 kids who have never once, in 11 years, made her feel like furniture, was the only person outside Renata, my father, and Agent Odom that I told anything to before the gala. And I told her only 4 days beforehand, on a phone call that lasted 2 hours and that I ended sitting on my bathroom floor with the fan running. The same bathroom fan I'd used the night I first confirmed the forged trust document. Because apparently that particular combination of white noise and cold tile had become, without my ever deciding it consciously, the specific place my body had chosen to process things it couldn't process anywhere else. Lucia did not tell me to be careful, or to reconsider, or to think of the children we didn't have together, the way I think a lot of people might have expected a sister to. She listened to the entire 6 weeks, in order, without interrupting, and at the end of it she said only, "Nessa, I've watched that family talk to you like you were the help for 9 years, and I've watched you let them, because you're the most patient person I've ever met in my life. I'm not going to tell you this is going to be easy. I'm going to tell you that I have never once, in 35 years, seen you build something that didn't hold, and I don't think you're about to start now." I have thought about that sentence more than almost anything else anyone said to me during that entire period, because it was the only piece of encouragement I received, across 6 weeks, that wasn't tactical, that wasn't about evidence or timing or legal sequencing, that was simply about who I was underneath all of it, and I needed exactly that on exactly that night, more than I think I let myself admit at the time. I want to tell you one more thing about my father, because I think it explains something important about where I actually learned to build a case like this one, and because the night before the gala, he gave me something I still think about constantly. Marcus Castellano spent his career prosecuting people who believed, with total and often quite charming confidence, that their specific brand of theft was too clever, too well connected, or too socially insulated to ever actually be traced. He told me once, years before any of this happened, over one of our Saturday diner breakfasts, about a case early in his career. A mid-level city official who had been skimming contractor kickbacks for 11 years and had, according to every single person who knew him, been the last person anyone would suspect. Precisely because he golfed with two aldermen and sat on the board of a well-regarded children's hospital charity. My father built that case over 14 months, alone at first, the way I would eventually build mine over 6 weeks. And he told me the thing that had stuck with him most from the entire experience wasn't the eventual conviction, but a comment the official's own wife made to a Tribune reporter after the sentencing. I always thought if something like this were happening, I would just know. My father used to say that sentence was the single most common thing spouses of white-collar criminals say, and the single most consistently wrong, because the entire architecture of financial fraud inside a marriage depends on one specific mechanism: a partner deciding, again and again, small decision by small decision, that noticing would cost more than not noticing, right up until the moment the cost of not noticing becomes unbearable all at once. The night before the gala, my father came to my house at 8 p.m., ostensibly to walk Ledger with me one last time before everything changed. Though I think we both understood the walk was really an excuse for him to check on me without either of us having to say the word scared out loud. We walked the same 6 houses, the same 6 dogs barking through the same 6 fences, and somewhere around the 4th house he said, without preamble, "You know, Vanessa, I spent 26 years putting people like Brad away, and I want to tell you something I never told you when you were younger, because I don't think you were ready to hear it. The hardest cases I ever built weren't the ones with the most money involved. They were the ones where the victim had spent years being told, by everyone around them, that they were the lucky one in the relationship. The ones who had the hardest time believing they deserved to fight back, because they'd been convinced, slowly, that gratitude was the only acceptable emotion they were allowed to have." He stopped walking, right there on Hoyne Avenue, under a streetlight that had been flickering for 3 weeks and that I'd been meaning to report to the city, and he said, "I need you to understand something before tomorrow night. You are not the lucky one in that marriage, and you never were. You are the reason that family had a functioning household to perform their whole legacy story from, and I don't think a single one of them has ever once said thank you to you for it. Tomorrow isn't revenge, mija. Tomorrow is a debt finally getting collected." I did not cry. This was, by that point in the 6 weeks, a genuinely rare thing for me. But I remember standing on that street with Ledger's leash in my hand, feeling something in my chest loosen for the first time in what felt like months. Because my father, a man who had spent 26 years being professionally unmoved by other people's tragedies, had just told me in his own careful prosecutorial way that he was proud of me, and that he had been watching this entire 6-week process not as a father worried about his daughter's marriage falling apart, but as a man who recognized, with total professional clarity, that his daughter was better at this work than he had ever been. I have thought about that streetlight conversation more than almost any other single moment in this entire story, because I think it's the piece that finally let me walk into that terminal the following night without the specific, low-grade guilt I had been quietly carrying underneath all 6 weeks of forensic precision. The guilt of wondering whether wanting accountability this badly, this specifically, this publicly, made me somehow as calculating as the people I was building a case against. My father's answer to that unspoken question, standing under a broken streetlight with our old dog sniffing at a fence, was the only answer I actually needed. That there is a profound difference between manufacturing a lie and simply refusing any longer to protect one. I want to take you into the sentencing hearing itself, 4 months after the gala, because I think it's the piece of this story where the last of my anger finally found somewhere to land and, strangely, somewhere to also finally set itself down. The hearing was held in a courtroom on the 25th floor of the Dirksen Federal Building, considerably smaller and considerably less theatrical than the ballroom where everything had actually unraveled, with maybe 40 people in the gallery, reporters, a handful of Ashford Meridian Group's remaining employees. Renata seated beside me in the second row, my father 2 seats down, arms crossed, watching the proceedings with the specific stillness of a man who had sat on the other side of this exact kind of hearing for 26 years and understood every procedural beat before it happened. Brad sat at the defense table in a gray suit that no longer fit him at all, having lost, by that point, close to 25 pounds since Aspen, flanked by a lawyer I recognized from local coverage as one of the city's more expensive white-collar defense attorneys, retained, I later learned, using the last of a home equity line Walter had taken out against the Winnetka house specifically to fund his son's defense. A detail that struck me, when I heard it, as almost unbearably fitting, given that the entire fraud had started with an illegally obtained home equity line against my own house 4 years earlier. The judge, a measured, soft-spoken woman named the Honorable Ruth Ferber, who had, according to my father, a reputation for giving white-collar defendants exactly the sentence the guidelines called for, and not a day less out of sympathy for their previously unblemished reputations, allowed victim impact statements before sentencing, and Renata had asked me, weeks earlier, whether I wanted to give one. I said yes almost before she finished the question. I stood at a small podium in that quiet, wood-paneled room, 4 feet from a man I had shared a bed with for 9 years, and I did not read from notes, because by that point I had said every true thing I needed to say to Brad Ashford in that one sentence in the terminal, months earlier, and what I needed to say now wasn't really for him at all. It was for the judge, and for the record, and, if I'm honest, for the 19-year-old girl at her grandmother's kitchen table who had first learned that everything has to balance in the end. Your Honor, I said, I've spent 11 years finding money that doesn't want to be found. I want the court to understand that the hardest case I ever built wasn't hard because the fraud was sophisticated. It wasn't. It was hard because for 6 weeks I had to hold 2 completely separate truths in my hands at the same time. The truth of what my husband had done to my family's finances, and the truth of 9 years I'd spent believing I'd built a life with someone who valued me. I want the record to reflect that the second truth turned out to be the more dangerous one, because it's the one that let the first one continue as long as it did. I'm not asking this court for anger on my behalf. I'm asking for accuracy, which is the only thing I've ever actually asked for, professionally or personally, in my entire life. Judge Ferber sentenced Brad to 31 months at the higher end of the federal guideline range for the amount involved, citing specifically, in her remarks, the calculated and repeated nature of the deception, extending not only to financial institutions but to the defendant's own spouse and family, over a period the court considers particularly aggravating given the breach of the most basic trust a marriage is meant to provide. I watched Brad's shoulders drop, slightly, at the word 31, and I felt, standing there in that quiet courtroom, not triumph exactly, but something calmer and more permanent, the specific, settled satisfaction of watching a column of numbers finally, after months of work, resolve to 0. The civil restitution judgment, secured separately by Renata over the following weeks, restored the full $291,000 to my grandmother's trust, plus statutory interest, plus an additional $81,000 covering the improperly encumbered equity in the Hoyne Avenue house, funded through a combination of the liquidation of Ashford Meridian Group's remaining assets and a structured payment plan against Brad's future earnings that Renata built with the specific, patient thoroughness of a woman who intended for every single dollar to eventually be accounted for, on paper, the way I had always believed money should be. I want to tell you what I did with that money once it was fully restored, because I think it matters more than any other single decision I made in the entire aftermath. I did not spend it on anything for myself. I sat with my grandmother's original ledgers, the actual physical notebooks she'd kept, in her careful, looping handwriting, tracking every dollar she'd saved across 40 years of factory work in Cicero, so that one day, her granddaughter could have something to build a life from. And I established, with the full amount, plus the additional funds I'd earned from the 4 new client engagements that came in after the gala, a scholarship fund at Morton College, the same community college where I'd taken my first 2 accounting courses at 19, specifically for first-generation students studying forensic and financial accounting, naming it, after considerable thought, not after myself, but simply the Castellano Ledger Fund, because I wanted the name people saw on the award letter to be the same name I'd learned everything from in the first place. 2 years out from that night in the terminal, I want to tell you where I actually am now, because I think the quiet, ordinary shape of a life rebuilt matters more than any single dramatic scene, even the one with federal agents walking through a century-old iron door. I have found, somewhat to my own surprise, that the specific texture of an ordinary Tuesday, coffee, a walk, a stack of client files that balance the way they're supposed to, dinner alone or with Theo, or with Lucia, on a video call from Denver, has become the thing I actually treasure most, considerably more than I ever expected to after spending 6 weeks building toward one enormous public night. The gala mattered. It mattered enormously, and I would build the exact same case again, without hesitation if I had to. But it turns out the actual reward was never the night everyone watched. It was every quiet, unremarkable morning since, where nothing at all is being hidden from me, in any drawer, in any account, in any closet, anywhere in my own house. I check, sometimes, out of a habit I don't think will ever fully leave me, a stray folder on a shared cloud drive, a line item on a statement that looks unfamiliar for half a second before I remember exactly what it is, and every single time, for 2 straight years now, it has balanced. That, more than any courtroom verdict, is the actual proof I was looking for the whole time. Not vindication, not an audience, just a life, finally, that adds up to zero the ordinary way. Quietly, on its own, without anyone having to go looking for what's missing. Castellano and Reyes moved 14 months ago into a larger office 3 floors up in the same building on North LaSalle, with a staff that's grown from 9 people to 16, 4 of them junior associates I personally recruited out of accounting programs at Morton College and other community colleges around the city. Because I have decided, somewhere in the past 2 years, that one of the most useful things I can do with the specific, hard-won expertise I built over 11 years is make sure it doesn't stay locked inside a small number of expensive downtown firms that most people who actually need forensic accounting help could never afford to walk into. We take on 2 pro bono cases a year now, specifically for individuals, not institutions, not corporations, individuals, who suspect a spouse or family member of financial fraud and have nowhere else to turn. Because I remember, with total clarity, what it felt like to sit at my own kitchen island at 2 a.m., wondering if what I was seeing was real. And I decided I did not want anyone else to have to build that case entirely alone unless they chose to. Brad was released 8 months ago, having served his sentence with the standard reduction for good conduct, and moved, according to the very limited information I still occasionally hear through my father's channels, to Indianapolis, where he works, I'm told, in a mid-level operations role for a logistics company, a considerable distance in every possible sense from the man who once stood on a small stage in a rented tuxedo, talking about legacy. I do not think about him often. I want to be honest that this took time. The first several months after the divorce finalized, I would still, occasionally, reach for my phone to tell him something funny Ledger had done before, remembering, with a small jolt, that this particular reflex no longer had anywhere true to go. But 2 years is a long time, and grief, even grief for a marriage built on a foundation that turned out to be mostly hollow, does eventually find its own quiet resolution if you let it. Walter Ashford passed away 11 months ago, of a heart condition he had apparently been managing quietly for years, and I want to tell you something that surprised me about how I received that news. I felt sad. Not for the man who had spent 9 years treating my career as an inconvenient footnote to the Ashford legacy, but for the specific tragedy of a person who had spent 70 years building an entire identity out of a story that had never actually been true, and who died, as far as I know, without ever once revising it. Diane did not invite me to the funeral, which I understood completely, and did not attend myself, though I did send flowers, quietly, without a card, because I had decided, somewhere in the past 2 years, that I did not need every ending in this story to carry a point. Grant, according to the same mutual acquaintance who has, over 2 years, become an unlikely but reliable source of updates I never asked for, but somehow always end up hearing anyway, is still with the same girlfriend, still working the same logistics job, and had, as of the last update I received, been promoted once, a piece of news that landed for me not as vindication but as something closer to quiet relief. The specific relief of learning that at least one person in that family had found, eventually, some version of an ordinary, self-sufficient life, even if it took losing everything he'd been handed for free to get there. Chelsea Monroe still works at the legal aid clinic on the South Side, and I know this because, in one of the stranger footnotes of this entire story, we ran into each other 18 months ago at a downtown coffee shop, both of us alone, both of us clearly recognizing each other from 4 tables away, and after a long moment of mutual hesitation, she walked over to my table and asked if she could sit down. We talked for 20 minutes. She thanked me, again, for what I'd told her that night on the phone, about finding her own lawyer, about protecting her own future rather than Brad's. I told her I was glad she'd taken the advice. It was not a warm conversation exactly. I don't think either of us will ever be friends, and I don't think either of us particularly wants to be, but it was an honest one, and I have come to believe over 2 years of sitting with everything that happened, that an honest conversation with someone who once helped dismantle your marriage is its own strange, specific kind of closure that I never once expected to get, and that I'm glad, in the end, I did. As for me, I am, at 40 years old, exactly as unglamorous and exactly as quietly content as I have ever wanted to be. I still walk Ledger, gray around the muzzle now, 14 years old, slower on our morning route but stubbornly unwilling to give it up entirely, past the same 6 houses, though one of the 6 dogs passed away last spring and I still, out of habit, glance at that fence every morning expecting to hear him bark. I have started seeing someone over the past 4 months, a structural engineer named Theo Whitfield. I met through a client referral, a quiet, steady man who asked me, on our third date, an actual question about my work that wasn't secretly a question about what I could do for him, and who has never once, in 4 months, made me feel like furniture with a checkbook. I don't know yet where that goes. I've stopped needing to know things immediately the way I once did, which is its own kind of growth I didn't expect this entire ordeal to hand me. I think about my grandmother's voice sometimes, still, at 2 a.m., when I can't sleep, telling me that everything has to balance, that if it doesn't, something is wrong, and it doesn't matter how long it takes you to find it. I understand now that she wasn't only teaching me how to read a ledger, she was teaching me how to read a life. And I think if she were here today, sitting across from me at that same worn kitchen table in Cicero, she would look at everything that happened. The trust, the forged signature, the airport, the gala, the federal agents walking through those iron doors in front of 600 witnesses, and she would tell me, in that same patient, unhurried voice, that it had, in the end, finally, all added up to zero. So let me ask you the same question I've been sitting with for 2 years now, whoever you are, watching this from wherever you're watching it. If someone in your life has been quietly underestimating you, telling themselves a story about how small you are that lets them sleep at night, how long are you going to let them keep believing it? And what exactly are you waiting for before you finally show them the actual math? I want to tell you about the search warrant because I didn't witness it myself. I was, at that exact hour, still standing in a rail terminal watching my husband get let out through a set of iron doors. But Agent Odom walked me through the broad strokes 6 weeks later, once the case had moved far enough along that she could share what wasn't sealed. And I think the details matter because they show you the other half of what 6 weeks of quiet, careful documentation actually bought. At 8:52 that same evening, 11 minutes after Brad was taken into custody at the gala, a second team of agents executed a search warrant at Ashford Meridian Group's offices on West Randolph. A warrant built, in significant part, off the exact chain of documents I had handed Agent Odom 2 months earlier: the Murden Holdings LLC filings, the Cascade Bridge Capital Collateral Schedule, the IP address logs tying the trust disbursement to an office router. Pat, the office manager who had signed paperwork without reading the entity name attached to it, was still at her desk finishing a task before heading to the gala herself when the agents arrived. And according to what Agent Odom told me, she wept, immediately and without any prompting, out of what appeared to be genuine shock rather than guilt, a detail that led the government to decline pursuing any charges against her at all. On the theory, one I happen to agree with, having met her exactly twice at company functions over the years, that Pat Delacroix was a woman who trusted her boss the way a lot of loyal, underpaid employees trust the person who signs their paycheck, and had never once been given a reason, until that night, to imagine that trust was being weaponized against her. The agents recovered, from a locked drawer in Brad's private office, a second set of financial records, a set I had never found in 6 weeks of searching, because it existed entirely on paper, in a leather portfolio, rather than anywhere digital, showing a pattern of similar, smaller diversions from at least 2 other sources: a construction escrow account belonging to a subcontractor on an earlier, unrelated Ashford Meridian project, and a retainer account belonging to a separate investor group that had put money into a development in the western suburbs 3 years before Meridian Row ever existed. Agent Odom told me, with what I understood to be considerable professional understatement, that your husband's pattern of behavior did not begin with your trust, Mrs. Ashford. It simply escalated there, the way it usually does, once the earlier instances went unnoticed. I sat with that fact for a long time after she told me. The knowledge that the fraud I had uncovered in my own marriage was not an aberration but a continuation of a habit Brad had been quietly refining for years before I ever came along, on people who had even less capacity to investigate him than I eventually did. And it changed, slightly, how I understood my own case. Not as an isolated betrayal, but as the one instance, out of what may have been several, where the person on the other end of the ledger happened to have the exact professional skill set required to actually catch it. I want to give you one more scene from those 6 weeks, one I haven't told you about yet, because I think it shows you the specific texture of what it meant to work with Renata Vance, and because I think her particular brand of ruthlessness deserves more than the single quote I gave you earlier. It happened during our third meeting, roughly 3 weeks before the gala, when I brought Renata a piece of information I'd been sitting on for several days, uncertain whether it was even relevant. A voicemail left on our home answering machine, an actual physical answering machine, an old habit of Brad's mother's that Diane had insisted we keep for when the grandchildren call, a grandchildren who did not yet exist and, as it happened, never would. From a Cascade Bridge Capital loan officer, warning that given recent developments, they were considering accelerating the loan's maturity date, a phrase that, when Renata heard it, made her set down her pen entirely. "Say that again," she said. I played her the voicemail. She listened to it twice, her expression unreadable, and then she said, "Vanessa, I want you to understand something about how lenders like Cascade Bridge actually operate. They do not accelerate a maturity date on a whim. Someone told them something. Either Brad panicked and disclosed something he shouldn't have, trying to buy himself room, or," she paused, and I watched her turn the second possibility over with the specific relish of a woman who genuinely enjoyed this part of the work. "Or someone else at Ashford Meridian is also starting to get nervous and started talking to people they shouldn't be talking to. Which means we may not be the only people building a case against your husband's company right now." That's useful. That's very useful. It means the walls are already starting to close in on their own, without us lifting a single additional finger, and I would very much like to find out exactly who's doing the talking before the FBI does. Because if it's someone with even better internal access than you had, Vanessa, that person's cooperation could shave months off Agent Odom's timeline. She was right, as it turned out. The internal source, we would learn months later, was a young associate in Ashford Meridian's own finance department who had noticed discrepancies in the Meridian Row books almost a full month before I ever found the flagged wire transfer, and had, out of a sense of professional obligation, Renata described admiringly as rare and worth remembering the name of for future hiring, quietly flagged the concern to a compliance contact at Cascade Bridge Capital, never once imagining it would eventually intersect with a wife's independent forensic investigation and a federal case built almost entirely in parallel, from two completely different directions, converging on the same 6 weeks, the same gala, the same set of iron doors. "This is what I mean," Renata told me, closing her folder at the end of that meeting, "when I say the only mistake you could make is doing this quietly. The moment more than one person starts asking honest questions about a lie this size, it doesn't matter how carefully it was built. It cannot hold. It was never built to survive more than one person looking closely at it at the same time, and you, Vanessa, made absolutely sure there would be considerably more than one." There's one more memory I want to give you before I let this story go, because I think it's the one that actually explains, more than any spreadsheet or forged signature ever could, why it took me 9 years to finally act, and why, once I did, I never once looked back with regret. Our wedding was small, by the Ashford family's standards, held at a restored barn venue in Galena that Diane had considered charmingly rustic in the specific tone she used for anything she found beneath her but was willing to tolerate for someone else's sake. And I remember standing at the back of that barn at 29 years old, my father's arm under mine, looking down the aisle at Brad waiting for me in a suit that, at the time, I thought looked like confidence, and would later understand, looked like a man who had never once had to check his own math. And I remember the specific, total certainty I felt in that moment. Not manufactured, not performed for the 60 guests watching, but real, complete certainty that I was walking toward a life that would hold. I want to tell you what Brad said in his vows, because I still remember them exactly, word for word, 9 years later, in a way that used to make me feel something soft and now makes me feel something closer to clinical interest. The way I might read an old contract I already know was breached. He said, "Vanessa, you are the steadiest person I have ever known, and I promise you, for the rest of our lives, that I will never once take that steadiness for granted." I have turned that sentence over more times than I can count in the 2 years since everything fell apart because I think it contains, entirely by accident, the exact shape of what actually happened to us. Brad did not break his promise through some single dramatic betrayal. He broke it the way most people break promises like that, slowly, in small increments, by mistaking my steadiness for something inexhaustible, something that didn't require maintenance or honesty or reciprocity. Something he could simply keep drawing against, year after year, the way he drew against my trust and my house equity and my firm's brokerage account, without ever once imagining there might be a bottom to it. There was no single moment, in 9 years, where I decided Brad had stopped loving me. I still don't know, honestly, whether he ever did, in whatever specific, limited way he was capable of loving anyone, including himself. What I know instead is that somewhere in those 9 years, Steadiness stopped being a quality Brad admired in me and became, instead, a resource he had simply learned to extract, the same way he'd learned to extract equity from a house, capital from a trust, and, eventually, an entire 14-month affair from a 27-year-old assistant who mistook his charm for genuine interest in her future, the same way I once had. I think about my father's sentence from that streetlight conversation often, that I was never the lucky one in that marriage, that I was the reason the household functioned at all, and I think, now, 2 years removed from all of it, that the actual tragedy of my 9 years with Brad Ashford wasn't the fraud, or even the affair, though both of those certainly earned their place in a federal courtroom. The actual tragedy was smaller and quieter and considerably more common than either of those headline-grabbing betrayals. It was 9 years of a genuinely capable, genuinely steady woman, slowly, patiently, convincing herself that being taken for granted was simply what marriage cost. Right up until the morning, a man slipped something into her carry-on bag at an airport and, in doing so, finally handed her undeniable, physical proof of exactly how little her steadiness had ever actually been worth to him. I do not regret the 9 years, strange as that might sound. I built a career, a home, a version of myself capable of the specific, 6-week precision that eventually unmade an entire family's carefully maintained fiction. And I don't think I would have built any of that particular strength without first surviving 9 years of being underestimated by people who never once bothered to check whether their assumptions about me actually balanced. They didn't, and I made absolutely sure in the end that they found out exactly how badly they didn't. In a room with 600 witnesses, under a 100-year-old iron roof, on a night that was supposed to be about someone else's legacy entirely. I haven't told you yet what happened in the 90 minutes right after the agents led Brad out of that terminal, because I think it deserves its own space, separate from everything else, since it was the only part of that entire night that belonged completely to me and no one else. The room did not empty quickly. 600 people, once the shock settled into something more like electric fascination, did the specific thing crowds do at the edge of a scandal. They clustered, in twos and threes, murmuring, glancing toward me with an expression I can only describe as a mixture of pity and hunger, waiting to see what the wife would do next, whether I would collapse, or weep, or flee toward the exit the way Chelsea had walked calmly toward hers. I did none of those things. I stood exactly where I had been standing when Brad said my name for the last time, in that black dress, and I let the room look at me for as long as it needed to, because I understood, even in that moment, that whatever story got told about this night for the rest of Chicago's memory of the Ashford name would be shaped, in part, by whether the wife looked destroyed or composed, and I had spent 6 weeks deciding, deliberately, which of those two women I intended to be. My father found me within 4 minutes, moving through the crowd with the specific, unhurried authority of a man who had walked into 100 rooms exactly like this one over 26 years, and he did not say anything at all. He simply put his hand on my shoulder, the same steady weight he'd used to guide me down 100 sidewalks as a child, and I felt, for the first time all evening, something in my own spine finally allow itself to soften. Just slightly, just enough. Renata reached us a moment later, phone already at her ear, coordinating with Agent Odom's team about next steps. Her voice pitched low and efficient, already 3 steps ahead of a night that had only just begun for her professionally, even as it was. In the ways that mattered most, already ending for me personally. We left through a side entrance, my father's hand at my elbow, past a cluster of photographers who had, by then, figured out enough of what happened to start shouting questions I did not answer. And I remember the specific cold of the October air outside that terminal, how it hit my bare shoulders and made me feel, for just a second, entirely and simply human again, after 3 hours of feeling like a woman executing a plan rather than a woman living a life. My father drove me home himself, in his own car, leaving mine at the venue to be retrieved the next day, and neither of us spoke for the first 10 minutes of the drive, the city sliding by in the specific golden and gray blur that Chicago takes on at night from inside a moving car, until finally, somewhere on Lakeshore Drive, he said, quietly, "You did it exactly right, Mija. Every single piece of it." I did not respond right away. I looked out the window at the lake, black and enormous beside us, and I thought about my grandmother's kitchen table, and my mother's schoolteacher's salary stretched thin across a Cicero childhood, and 9 years of dinners where I had smiled and passed the salt, and let an entire family mistake my silence for smallness, and I said, finally, in a voice that surprised me with how steady it still was after everything, "I know, Dad. I know I did." He walked me into my own house that night, checked every room the way he'd done exactly twice before in 9 years. Both times I now understood, because some paternal instinct had already been quietly worried about this exact outcome long before either of us had proof of anything. And Ledger, who had been alone since 6 that evening, greeted us at the door with the specific frantic joy of a dog who has no idea his person's entire life just changed shape. And I sat down on my kitchen floor, still in the black dress, and let him climb into my lap the way he hadn't been able to do easily in years, and I put my face against the top of his graying head, and I finally, completely, let myself feel the whole 6 weeks land at once. Not as grief, exactly, and not quite as triumph either, but as something unnamed and enormous that simply needed somewhere to go. And for the first time since that Thursday night at my kitchen island, with a blank spreadsheet in front of me, I let it. My father sat at my kitchen table the entire time, not speaking, not rushing me, just present, the way he had been present at 100 diner breakfasts across 38 years. And after a while, I don't know exactly how long, time had gone strange and soft by then, he made 2 cups of tea, set one in front of the empty chair beside me on the floor, and said, "Take your time. The rest of it can wait until tomorrow." And for the first time in 6 weeks, for the first time honestly in 9 years, I let something wait. There's one final thread I want to pull on before I let you go, because I think it answers the question people ask me most now, when they eventually find out some version of this story, whether at a networking event or, once, memorably, from a stranger at a dog park who recognized me from a local news segment I didn't even know had aired. They ask whether I ever felt guilty watching Chelsea Monroe walk toward that agent with her head up, watching Walter's face go slack at the microphone, watching Diane's champagne glass hover motionless in the air, whether some part of me flinched at how thoroughly I dismantled an entire family's evening, their reputation, their sense of themselves, all in service of a plan I had built, alone, in 6 weeks, at a kitchen island with a beagle asleep against my foot. I want to answer that honestly, because I think it's the one piece of this story I haven't fully addressed yet. Yes, there were moments, not many and never for long, but they were real, where some old, trained part of me, the part that had spent 9 years absorbing friction quietly rather than causing it, whispered that I had done something excessive, something disproportionate, something that a kinder woman might have handled with a quiet divorce filing and a sealed settlement instead of a room full of 600 witnesses. I sat with that whisper several times in the weeks after the gala, and each time I came back to the same 2 facts, laid out as plainly as any forensic report I've ever written. Fact 1. I never manufactured a single piece of evidence. Every transfer, every forged signature, every hotel folio, every text message was real, documented, and independently verifiable by a federal agent and a licensed attorney, neither of whom had any personal stake in punishing the Ashford family beyond doing their jobs correctly. I did not create the fraud. I found it, the way I have found other people's hidden fraud for 11 years, and I handed it to the exact institutions built to handle it appropriately. Fact 2. I never once asked anyone to time anything for maximum humiliation. Agent Odom's timeline moved at its own institutional pace, shaped by evidence and procedure, not by my preference for a dramatic evening. Renata's injunction was filed the moment it was legally ready, not a day earlier or later for effect. The gala's date had been set by Diane, 8 months before I ever found a single forged document, entirely independent of anything I did. What I chose, the only thing I actually chose, in the strictest sense, was not to intervene in a process that was already, on its own, converging toward a specific room on a specific night, and to make absolutely certain I would be standing in that room, in a dress I'd chosen for myself rather than one Diane had approved when it did. I have decided, in the 2 years since, that this distinction matters enormously, and that it's the entire reason I can look at everything that happened without the specific, corrosive guilt that I think would follow me if I had actually engineered a public humiliation rather than simply declined to protect 4 people from the natural, foreseeable consequences of what one of them had built. There is a version of this story where I file quietly, settle quietly, disappear from the Ashford family's life without a single public reckoning, and let Walter keep his boards, let Diane keep her guest list, let the 600 people who called me lucky that night keep believing whatever comfortable fiction let them enjoy their raw bar in peace. I considered that version briefly, somewhere around week 3, in a moment of exhaustion where quiet felt easier than accurate. I decided against it in the end, for the same reason my grandmother taught a 19-year-old girl that everything has to balance, no matter how long it takes to find the discrepancy. Quiet endings let liars keep their story, public ones make the story, finally, actually true. I think, too, about the specific women who have reached out to me since some version of this story became known. Not many, maybe a dozen over 2 years, but each one distinct, each one arriving in my inbox or my office lobby with the same particular posture, the posture of someone who has spent a long time being careful about how much space they take up. A dental hygienist from Rockford whose husband had quietly opened 4 credit cards in her name over 6 years to fund a gambling habit she hadn't known existed until a collections call reached her directly. A retired schoolteacher from Oak Park whose adult son had been slowly draining her retirement account under the guise of managing her investments better than the bank could, a phrase that landed for me with an almost unbearable familiarity. Each of them asked me some version of the same question, sitting across from my desk with the same careful, apologetic energy of someone worried they were overreacting. Is this normal, or is this actually as bad as I think it is? I have learned, over 2 years of hearing that question in slightly different words, that the answer is almost always the same, and it is almost never the one they're hoping for, and it is almost always exactly the reason they walked into my office in the first place, instead of simply asking their spouse or their son directly. Some part of every single one of them, like some part of me for 9 years, already knew. I tell each of them the same thing I wish someone had told me 9 years earlier. In that Cicero kitchen, or at that Galena barn, or at any one of the 100 dinner tables where I chose quiet over accurate. That the discomfort of finding out is always, without exception, smaller than the cost of spending years pretending you haven't already started to. That's the whole account, as completely and honestly as I know how to give it to you. I've told you about the airport, the trust, the forged signature, the affair, the gala, the federal agents, the sentencing, the 2 years since. I've told you about my grandmother's kitchen table, and my father's streetlight sentence, and Renata's mahogany desk, and Agent Odom's cold conference room. There's only one more thing I haven't told you yet, and I'm not going to tell it to you today, because it hasn't finished happening yet, and I think you deserve to hear it the way I actually lived it, not folded neatly into an epilogue that makes it sound tidier than it currently feels. 6 days ago, a certified letter arrived at my office, addressed to Castellano and Reyes, from a compliance officer at a private bank in Winnetka. I had never once had reason to deal with professionally. I want to tell you exactly how my stomach dropped when I saw the return address, because 2 years out from all of this, I genuinely believed I had built enough distance from the Ashford name that a letter like this could no longer do that to me, and I was wrong, and I think that's an honest thing to admit rather than pretend otherwise for the sake of a cleaner story. The letter was from a woman named Corinne Halstead, a private banker who had, for the past 19 years, quietly managed a modest trust account belonging to Diane Ashford's own mother, Brad's maternal grandmother, a woman named Eleanor Voss who had passed away 6 years ago and left behind an account that, according to the original 1997 trust document, was meant to be distributed in equal thirds to Diane and her 2 siblings upon Eleanor's death. Corinne Halstead had written to me, specifically, because she had recently come across an old file note referencing my name as forensic contact prior related matter, left, I would later learn, by an internal compliance analyst who had cross-referenced the Ashford family name against a database flag connected to Brad's federal case, and had found something in Eleanor Voss's trust records that Corinne Halstead described, in careful, understated banking language, as an irregularity in a 2019 distribution that predates but bears procedural similarities to a matter your firm may have separately investigated. I called her within the hour. I want you to understand that I did not call her because I was looking for another crusade. 2 years is a long time, and I have built, deliberately and carefully, a life that no longer needs one. I called her because 11 years of training does not simply switch off, and because the specific phrase irregularity in a 2019 distribution is not a phrase forensic accountants are able to hear and then simply set back down. Corinne Halstead told me, in a conversation I am still, 6 days later, turning over in my mind at 2 a.m., the way I haven't done in nearly 2 years, that in 2019, 3 years before Brad's fraud against my own trust ever began, 4 years before that terminal, 5 years before Walter's death, a disbursement of $140,000 had moved out of Eleanor Voss's trust and into an account that, when Corinne finally traced it fully, led back to a home renovation loan taken out by Diane Ashford, personally, on the Winnetka house, structured through a document bearing her 2 siblings' signatures, Signatures that Eleanor Voss's other two children, Diane's own brother and sister, people I had met exactly twice at family funerals in 9 years and knew almost nothing about, have apparently spent the last several weeks insisting, with increasing agitation according to Corinne, that they never actually signed. I have not yet opened a new binder. I have not yet called my father, or Renata, or anyone at all beyond Corinne Halstead herself. Because some part of me, the part that spent 2 years finally, carefully, building a life that did not orbit the Ashford name, genuinely does not know yet whether I want to walk back into that particular kind of work a second time, with a family I have already spent 9 years of my life inside of once. But I sat at my kitchen island last night, with Ledger's graying head against my foot, exactly the way I sat there 3 years ago, with a blank spreadsheet and a 41-row ledger that started all of this, and I found myself, almost without meaning to, opening a new file. Column A, date. Column B, amount. Column C, account of origin. I haven't filled in column D yet, and I'm not sure, honestly, whether I will. But old habits, it turns out, don't fully retire just because the case that built them did. I'll tell you what I find there, if it turns out to be anything, in the next one. And if there's any part of you that just felt your own pulse pick up reading that sentence, you already know exactly why you should be subscribed before I post it. Because you clearly wanted to know how this one ends before I'd even finished telling you the last one. And that's exactly the kind of person who doesn't want to miss what column D turns out to say. Whenever I finally decide it's time to fill it in, and something tells me, sitting here with an empty column D staring back at me, that decision is already a great deal closer than I am currently. In this exact moment, sitting here at my own kitchen island with an old dog asleep against my foot, and a cup of tea going quietly cold beside my keyboard, letting on.